close your eyes and drift into a gentle what-if. Tonight, we imagine a quiet visitor from the deep interstellar night, 3i Atlas, gliding into the solar system and meeting the sleepy red world of Mars. No alarms, no urgency, just a soft, slow journey through possibilities told like a bedtime story for curious minds. Out in the deep between the stars, where distances have no edges and time feels like a slow exhale, a small wanderer drifts. It does not know its first sunrise or its last sunset. It only knows motion, a steady, quiet glide through a darkness that is not empty, but softly threaded with dust, fields, and whispers of old starlight. Long ago, in a system that is not our own, it was pressed together from cold grains and vapours, its surface stained by the cosmic rays into a gentle reddish hue. Here a pocket of frozen gases, there a seam of rock and fragile ice, the sort of fragile ancient matter that remembers the weather of creation. It is unhurried. It does not seek. It simply continues. There is no sound out here. If you were near it, you would hear only your own breath. The wanderer turns very slowly, a calm tumble that never quite becomes a spin, exposing first one face and then another to the weak glow of far-off suns. Micrometeoroids pass like sleepwalkers, brushing a grain from the surface, adding another layer of history to the skin. Radiation paints it over eons, polishing, scarring, tinting. The void around it is not still. It is a quiet river, and the traveller is a leaf that does not resist the current. At times, the wanderer crosses soft borders that only the sun can draw, vast sheets of charged particles and magnetic fields that billow and fold like invisible curtains. The heliosphere's edge is not a wall, but a glow that grows brighter ahead, a hint of warmth up in the distance. Each day, though day means little here, the sun gains a fraction in size, a pale coin that thickens with promise. The trajectory is not random. Gravity's threads, spun from the sun and the planets, pull and pluck until the path bends oh so gently inward. From far away, the object looks like nothing at all. Not a sparkle, not a point of light your eyes could catch. But our machines can listen more carefully than we can. Wide-field eyes sweep the sky each night, and on one of those patient sweeps, a faint ember shifts by less than a whisper across the starfield. Pixels breathe, numbers hum, software notices. A silence is broken not by a shout but by a line in a log, a tiny change that means a new traveller has entered the story. Astronomers compare photographs taken hours apart, then nights apart. The faint dot moves against the fixed constellations, a careful step in a dance so wide it cannot be seen at once. Orbital fits begin, uncertain at first, hyperbolic perhaps, or something very close. The word interstellar settles onto screens and into minds like soft snow on stone. They name it in our way, yet it is older than our language. We call it 3i Atlas, a label that fits in our ledgers and lets us speak about it without pointing. The name is a lantern, the object is the night path itself, through small mirrors and large ones. Through spectrographs and patient algorithms, we feel for its texture at a distance. The light it reflects is thin and steady, no bold flashes, no wild flares. Its colour suggests the chemistry of ancient ice and carbon-rich dust, the kind that has been sitting in the dark for so long that new and old have traded places. Closer to the sun, heat is not a shout but a suggestion, and the suggestion becomes an invitation. Frozen gases buried near the surface begin to stir. Sublimation starts like a shy breath through hair-thin cracks. A veil forms grain by grain. First a dust halo, then a faint coma that tucks close to the nucleus, reluctant to let go. It is not dramatic, it is gentle. The tail, when it appears, is a fine brush stroke so thin you could mistake it for a trick of the eye, unless you already knew it was there. Sunlight pushes dust outward. The solar wind combs it. The whole thing becomes a slow-motion fountain, lit from within. In the wanderer's own frame there is only the cool rhythm of rotation and the delicate push of escaping vapour. Jets chuff softly where sunlight lingers a little longer, nudging the body in tiny ways that accumulate over days. It is not a perfect stone, it is a living relic, shedding and reshaping as it warms. Beneath its fragile skin, layered like pages of a book, lie particles and trapped gases that have not seen starlight since before our planet learned to dream. Each flicker of outgassing is a page turning itself. We watch from far above our own air, where our orbiters circle Earth with their eyes open, and from the ground where calm domes open to the night. The signals come home as staircases of numbers, and the numbers become meaning. A light curve hints at a rotation period, long, unhurried, perhaps with a wobble. The spectrum holds fingerprints of simple molecules, water ice if the warming deepens, perhaps hints of carbon-bearing companions. Nothing shouts, everything whispers. Between our world and the traveller lies the thick geometry of the solar system, a lacework of paths that have been threaded by countless bodies since before anyone kept track. The newcomer is polite. It slips between these larger itineraries without fuss. A planet's gravity nods and tugs as it passes. A moon's pull adds a small bow. The sun conducts in silence. We model these encounters not because the wanderer will obey exactly, no one ever does, but because the effort to understand is itself a kind of listening. Think of the dust that clings to it, grains the size of flour and grains the size of breath. Each one holds stories of magnetic fields curling through a nursery disc, of early suns flaring and quieting, of fragments colliding and sticking, of warm regions and cold shadows. Everything here is both fragile and stubborn, and that paradox is what allows it to last. The traveller has already survived 1,000 delicate accidents. It will survive 1,000 more, or it will not, and either way the cosmos will remain untroubled. We are the ones who feel wonder at its survival. We are the ones who give it a name and stay up late to greet it. In the spaces between measurements, imagination does its steady work. We picture the surface up close, hummocks of dust, crusted plains, cracks outlined with hoarfrost, little cliffs where a chunk broke free, sometime no one recorded. We imagine a place that has never had a noon, the way we mean it, only cycles of dimmer and brighter, colder and less cold. If you could reach out and touch it, your glove would come away powdered, and the powder would be older than the mountains on Earth. You would feel no weight there to speak of, only the idea of weight. And yet, through all this strangeness, there is a deep familiarity. The traveller is foreign, but its language is planetary. Ice, rock, sunlight, shadow. These are the syllables we know. The same physics that lays frost on the grass before dawn is at work here, scaled to silence. The same arithmetic that guides a thrown pebble toward the ground is the arithmetic that draws 3-eye Atlas along its long arc toward the places where the sun's warmth can be felt on the skin, if it had skin. Hour by hour, distance unwinds. The point of light thickens just a little, then a little more. Our predictions sharpen, our pictures improve. Articles are published with gentle caution, diagrams annotated with dotted lines and ranges. Amateur observers join the watch, their telescopes humming in back gardens and on quiet hillsides, sending in times, positions and thin threads of brightness. The sky, as it always does, accepts our looking without complaint. And out there, beyond the reach of any human hand, the traveller keeps moving, carrying its private winter into the sunlight it has not seen in an age. The red world turns so slowly that a single cloud can seem to hover for an hour above a lonely hill. The air is thin and cool, mostly carbon dioxide, and it lies over the land like a whisper. Grains of dust hang in it, iron-rich, fine as talc, so that light does not simply arrive, it sifts. The ground is a tapestry of rust and stone, crusted with long memories. The rims of craters softened by ages, dunes braided by patient winds, ancient riverbeds etched like faded script. Here and there the rocks split into layers that once met flowing water, now frozen into stillness. When the sun climbs, its light is pale, but it stretches far, painting every pebble with a long shadow that makes small things look important. At the poles, winter breathes in and the air itself turns to frost, building caps that gleam like glass laid over red felt. Then spring returns and that frost exhales, becoming wind that runs down slopes and along channels, tugging at dust, sending little avalanches into motion. Even in the warmth, a chill lingers. Heat does not soak in very deep. The first inch of soil is awake by noon, while the layers below remain in a long, slow dream. By night, the warmth slips away into space and frost flowers on the stones, delicate and temporary as a thought you almost remember. The planet's heart is quiet, but not silent. Deep within, it shifts and adjusts, and the surface sometimes answers with a small quake, a tremor you would not feel with your feet, but that a listening instrument can hear. In the lowlands, the air moves with soft confidence. Dust devils rise like transparent cords, then loosen and drift apart. On high volcanoes, gentle giants with slopes so broad you must be told you're climbing them, thin winds curl along the ridgelines, combing the cold. You could walk here, slowly and carefully, and your steps would be lighter than you expect, the ground answering with a faint crunch that seems to arrive a moment after your boot meets the soil. Your horizon would pull close around you, low gravity stretching space in a way your eyes cannot quite phrase. If you spoke, your voice would go nowhere. If you listened, you would hear the quiet, and maybe the hiss of wind sliding a film of dust over a rock, the smallest possible sound of a planet tidying itself. Across the equatorial lands, day is a little longer than a day at home, and Mars keeps this time with a steady patience. Mornings are quick and clean, the sun pops up and the ground begins to warm at once, as if the light has been waiting just behind the edge of the world. Around local noon, the sky is not the rich blue of our seas, but a soft, washed tan, with the promise that when evening comes it might turn a cool, improbable blue at the horizon, the dust scattering light in reverse of what we know. Twilight lingers and does not. Shadows appear to stretch forever, then the darkness is simply there, starrier than you thought possible. Long scars cross the planet, valleys so wide they could hold continents and still have room for silence. Their walls fall in steps, ledges and buttresses, and brown-grey faces where ancient landslides have crusted into place. In their bottoms, dunes arrange themselves like sleeping animals, and boulders sit where they were placed by some forgotten moment. Faint clouds sometimes stitch thin veils along the rims, ice crystals floating their measured paths until they evaporate without ceremony. Craters count time here. Big ones, small ones, double-rimmed and scalloped, raised on ejector skirts that have been smoothed and picked at by a billion days of wind. Inside some craters you can find layered mounds, paper-stacked stone that clumped into being grain by grain, built by the rhythm of seasons and storms. In others, the floor is flat and dark, lava pooled and set, then cracked into plates that have shifted no further. Around them, the land buckles in gentle arcs. Between them, the highways of the ancient rivers run, their deltas frozen in place like paused handwriting. Sometimes a storm begins, not with drama, but with a quiet thickening. Dust lifts from one place and then another. The air becomes more present. Horizons fade. The world does not hurry even then. A storm can grow until it wraps the planet, a gauze that lets the sun shine through as a pale disk. Or it can remain local, folding and unfolding around a basin for days, careful as a cat. When it passes, the surface seems rearranged, even if everything sits where it was. The colour changed just a hint, drift edges sharpened, a small rock now wearing a new collar of dust. The nights are honest. Stars here look like they do everywhere. Hard points, cold and untroubled, and the Milky Way draws its faint white river over the red land. Phobos moves quickly, a small stone lantern tugged by the gravity into a tight, hurried orbit, tracing short paths across the sky. Deimos is farther and slower, a thoughtful spark that takes its time. Neither throws much light. Shadows are a matter of starlight and your own imagination. In certain places, if you scrape the surface gently, you would find ice just below, white, granular, careful with its cold. In others, salts bloom in the soil, telling of water that visited long ago and left quietly. There are minerals here that grow in the presence of liquid, and those that arrive when things are very dry indeed, and Mars wears both kinds, layered and interleaved, unwilling to be simple. It has had many climates, each slower than history, and it has kept them all, stacked in cliffs, mixed in plains, dusted across the backs of small stones. Robots are the only footprints, wheels pressed into soil, metal feet that set down and rose again, parachutes that blossomed and fell. Some are awake, their cameras blinking, their instruments tasting the air. Some are long asleep, roofs dimming under dust, batteries quiet. Far above, silent arcs of orbiters thread their paths. They listen to the ground, measure the breath of the atmosphere, glance at the polar caps, peer into canyons and across dune seas. Their signals leave Mars travelling slower than thought but faster than any bird, carrying maps and sectra, and the long, patient heartbeat of a world that is not ours and yet never feels far. Where the land lifts into plateaus, the wind lays down striations that look like writing. On slopes, dark streaks appear and fade with the seasons, as if something melted and then changed its mind, or as if the dust itself learned to flow. In low places, polygonal patterns quilt the ground, faint signatures of freeze and thaw. Even the rocks sometimes gather themselves into little circles, sorted by stones that roll a few inches a year, as determined and absent-minded as anything in nature. If you stand still long enough, you notice Mars is a place of waiting, of forces that work indifferently but not cruelly, of cycles that are huge and delicate at once. The planet's tilt leans enough to give seasons, and those seasons arrive like travellers who do not knock, bringing exactly what they always bring. Autumn comes coasting in with a metallic brightness. Winter settles and grows a silver edge. Spring steps lightly and sets off winds. Summer is not hot so much as clear-eyed. Everything moves, but without urgency. The world does not feel empty. It feels spacious, as if it has been expecting a conversation and is content to have it take a very long time. The soil here is not soil in the way we use the word. It is ground that has been ground again, a mineral flower that remembers every strike of every small impact and every breath of every old wind. Touch it, and it clings, electrostatic, eager to ride with you. Leave it alone, and it arranges itself by rules as old as hills, making ripples that march, cross, and sometimes sing when the wind is right. Low notes that travel only a short distance in the cold, thin air. Light does something special at the end of day. The sun sinks and the sky near the horizon turns a narrow, surprising blue, a band that looks like a secret. The rest of the sky holds to its mild tan, and the land takes on a deeper red, richer and calmer, even as the air grows sharp. Rocks that were modest become statues. A single blade of a shadow can look like a monument. Then the sun nods below the edge, and the chill drops quickly, and frost begins its quiet work on the same stones it left only hours before. Under that sky, waiting has a texture. It is the coolness of the shadow of a boulder at the noon, the tremor of a tiny quake that loosens sand on a slope no one will ever climb, the bright point of Phobos slipping beyond a ridge, the click of dust grains as they settle into a new angle. It is the steady line where dawn is already walking toward night somewhere else on the planet, and the way the thin air carries a curl of sunlight into a canyon and then lets it go. It is the sense that the red world is listening in its own way, not for a message, but for the next small change in light, in wind, in the quiet arithmetic of gravity that never stops adding and never stops subtracting. And beyond that arithmetic, beyond the soft breathing of its seasons, space stretches outward, wide enough for a visitor's path to cross the sky without sound, wide enough for the approach of 3i Atlas to be only another line to be written across the patient dust. Gravity does not shout, it suggests. It does not shove, it leans. Out in the quiet where 3i Atlas drifts, the sun's pull is not a rope but a field of gentle slope, a landscape you cannot see yet feel at every point. Even from far away, that slope has a direction, down and inward, and the traveller follows it. Not in a straight fall, but along a curve pulled taut by speed. Momentum is the traveller's habit. Gravity is the habit's correction. Between the two, a path is negotiated. Imagine the solar system as a shallow bowl. The sun sits at the centre, deepening the bowl's middle. The planets make slight dimples that ride around the rim. 3i Atlas skims the bowl's surface, not a marble rolling, but a moat sliding along a contour it never knew it chose. Each kilometre closer steepens the slope almost imperceptibly. Velocity climbs in tiny steps. A number called V infinity, the speed the traveller would keep if the sun were suddenly gone, stays mostly the same. Because the sun does not give speed, it trades direction for it. What changes is the pointing of the arrow, the tilt of the path, the phase of arrival, all the quiet geometry that decides whether the traveller will pass high and aloof or stoop low where worlds can meet it with their smaller songs. Mars sings softly. Its gravity is modest next to the sun's, but near the planet modesty is enough. Around the red world is an invisible district, the hill sphere, within which Mars is the main decision maker. Far outside that bubble, the sun is boss. Just inside, authority overlaps. Deeper in, the planet's vote carries the day. 3i Atlas approaches the boundary, and the arithmetic begins to bend. To a navigator's mind, the sky ahead becomes a map of possibilities, each traced by a parameter that sounds like a letter whispered sideways. The B-plane and the impact parameter, the closest approach corridor, values that are not poetry but read like it if you know how to listen. The threads themselves are forces and moments. The sun pulls with a steady hand. Mars adds a fingertip tug that grows as distance shrinks, curving the trajectory with a touch that looks like mercy but is only math. Phobos and Deimos are too small to grab much, yet they matter as punctuation, tiny edits in a manuscript that has been revised by larger authors. Even the escaping gases from the surface of 3i Atlas, those faint jets that breathe when sunlight lingers, contribute a bias, millimeters per second that accumulate like interest, sliding the future by a few heartbeats, and, on cosmic scales, that can be enough. When people on Earth run the numbers, they lay out paths on top of paths, patch conics for a first guess. One conic for the sun's domain, another for Mars's, stitched where the authorities change. Then higher fidelity models, where Mars is not a perfect sphere, and the atmosphere is not a uniform veil, where pressure and density fall in patient gradients, and the planet's slight bulge at the equator adds its own flavour to the pull. They watch the arrival asymptote, the line along which 3i Atlas seems to arrive if you extend its path backward to infinity, and they rotate that line through possibilities to see where a nudge or a breath of gas might make the difference between a steep skimming pass and a deeper plunge. There are waypoints that exist only in equations yet behave like places. Lagrange points, the 5 balances where the pulls of sun and planet can cancel or conspire. L1 and L2 sit along the Sun-Mars line like balanced pebbles. L4 and L5 ride ahead and behind Mars in its orbit, gathering dust and stability the way eddies gather leaves. L3 lurks on the far side of the sun, more idea than destination. 3i Atlas does not care about the names, but its path runs through the influence of these balances, and the math notices, and the path bends accordingly. The act of bending is flight dynamics made calm. A hyperbola around Mars is sketched by a single number called eccentricity, another called pericenter distance. If that pericenter dips below the thin top of the Martian air, then the pull of gravity is not the only stitch in the cloth. Drag pulls too, converting motion to heat with a kindness that looks like fire. If the pericenter stays high, gravity alone does the wheeling. Turning the velocity vector by an angle you can compute with a pencil and a patient sigh. Turn a little, a flyby. Turn a lot, a slingshot towards somewhere else. Turn too far and too low, a meeting with rock and regolith. 3i Atlas is not raising its hand to choose. Its earlier coughs of vapour chose for it days ago. So did the timing of its first noticing, the way our telescopes measured and predicted, the small biases in light pressure on its dust tail, the solar wind on its halo. The future is a sum, and every term matters. All the while Mars rotates, once every day and a little, so the planet's face that will greet the traveller is not the one we see when we first plot the encounter. This adds a slow ballet to the calculation, not only where the path will cross the planet's orbit, but which longitude will be there to meet it, which slope of which crater rim will happen to be under the sky at that minute. To a human, this sounds like fate. To gravity, it is just phase alignment. To an orbiter watching from above, it is a chance to pivot, point a camera, graze a signal off an atmosphere, collect how the density profile changes when a newcomer's shock front ripples the thin air. Every gravitational interaction is a transaction of sorts, but not the kind you can reverse with a receipt. 3i Atlas brings kinetic energy relative to Mars. Mars can take some of that energy in the form of a tiny perturbation to the velocity of its mass centre around the Sun, so tiny that no instrument we own could care. The rest is redistributed as heat if the traveller touches air, or as crumbled rock if it reaches ground. None of this is personal. The law that people tuck into textbooks, the vis viva equation, makes neat predictions with two bodies, and then the third body arrives and reminds us that neatness is a convenience, not a right. There is a kind of gravitational focusing even before the encounter. As 3i Atlas nears the general neighbourhood of Mars's orbit, the arc of its path is pulled a little toward the planet simply because the planet sits there and gravity is patient. Lines that would have missed by more now miss by less. Lines that would have passed behind are teased forward. Visualize it as a lens. Mars is a weak lens compared to the Sun, but lenses stack, and the combined curvature guides the traveller into lanes. In a simulation, you could colour those lanes by outcome. Pass high blue, skim low gold, touch air orange, meet ground red. The shades blend because reality does not offer clean borders. A stray jet on the sunlit side can move orange toward red without asking permission. Mars's atmosphere is too thin to be a wall, but it is not nothing. Above the planet, density decreases by scale height, down and down until molecules become a crowd and a crowd becomes a fluid. The uppermost wisps can reach a hand into space on solar activity days, puffing higher and then relaxing when the wind from the sun quiets. If 3i Atlas threads this region, even for seconds, the drag it feels is a finger on the record, small but enough to change the song. And below that, if the traveller dips deeper, the finger becomes a palm. Shock forms at the nose, ablation skims away the outermost fragile crust. The path bends more steeply, and the next moments are decided by the balance between the speed at entry and the thickness of the air along the line. But remain in the regime where only gravity speaks, and you can watch a different artistry. The turning angle of a hyperbolic flyby around a body with standard gravitational parameter mu depends on V infinity and the distance of closest approach. Higher V infinity, smaller turn. Lower V infinity, larger turn. 3i Atlas carries a V infinity set by its deep space arrival. Mars offers mu set by its mass. You can feel the inevitability as a kind of music. 2 notes given, the chord is forced. And yet, in the decimals, pericenter altitude, a handful of kilometers one way or the other, the chord can shift enough to swing the outgoing asymptote so that the traveller's next appointment is with the sun alone, or with the plane of the asteroid belt. or with a later, slower spiral through the inner system that glances off Earth's orbital garden without disrespect. There are eddies in this river, secular resonances that tug slowly on anything that lingers, mean motion resonances, where repeated encounters can stack like waves, each small push timed with the same rhythm, adding to a larger effect. 3i Atlas is a single pass story unless some energy is shed, otherwise it will not be captured. Ballistic capture would require the traveller to arrive not too fast and along a path that lets atmospheric drag or a lucky chain of interactions bleed speed at exactly the right moments. This is not common. The sky can do it, but it rarely bothers. Most interlopers come, curve and go, leaving Mars with a new crater if they dip too low, and leaving its orbiters with a new dataset if they remain high. Watch how the coordinate frames change. Far out you measure everything with respect to the Sun, because the Sun's gravity solves the biggest part of the problem. Near Mars you switch frames, centering parameters on the planet, because now the local gradient matters more. At the boundary the two frames do not argue, they handshake. They are both true, simply tuned for different scales. This is what threads of gravity really means, a tapestry that holds together because each thread carries tension appropriate to its length, and the crossing of threads creates structure you can trust. Communication delays add their own flavour to the experience. If an orbiter near Mars wants to watch the encounter, mission planners set pointing profiles in advance. The light time lag means there is no steering in the moment, only commands sent earlier, unfolding in a choreography that assumes the predictions are good. Predictions become good when measurements are good. Measurements become good when nights are clear and software calibrated, and the subtle jets on the sunlit side of 3i Atlas behave consistently for just a little while. Even the orientation of the traveller matters. Tumbling can smear out gassing into a pattern that looks random at the scale of hours, then repeats over days if the rotation period asserts itself. Those tiny forces write small italic notes into the trajectory. Below on the planet itself, gravity writes in broader strokes. Surface acceleration is roughly a third of Earth's. That sets the pace for falling and the reach of a thrown stone and the way dust returns to the ground. Where 3i Atlas might meet Mars, the local topography nudges the last instance. Hills that rise into the path, basins that invite a few more meters of descent before touch, slopes that lean one way or another and turn a vertical approach into a glancing strike. Gravity does not care about the texture of the last meter. It cares about mass and distance, but texture decides details, how ejector will loft, what angle fragments will prefer, where shock will couple more fiercely with bedrock and where it will spend itself in rubble. There is a separate thread that is not gravitational yet changes how gravity is felt. The pressure of light. Sunlight carries momentum. For large things it is negligible. For small and feathered it is a draft in a corridor. The dust leaving 3i Atlas as it warms catches that draft. Particles are sorted by size. The smallest are pushed hardest, their orbits about the Sun drifted outward and backward. This sorting makes a tail, and, more quietly, changes the total mass of the nucleus by the slightest breath. Less mass means a different response to gravity, but the difference is so small you could hide it inside a rounding error. Still, in a story where decimals decide outcomes, even small whispers are worth hearing. In the control rooms and on laptops in kitchens and sheds, plots bloom. Time on one axis, distance on another, argument of periapsis sliding, right ascension of ascending node precessing, true anomaly counting down to encounter. Each line is a pledge that the sky intends to keep. Uncertainties are shaded as clouds around the lines, narrowing as more observations come in. When the shades collapse to a thread, people nod. They know that the sky is still free to improvise, but the key and tempo are set. And so the path continues to lean, not because it chooses, but because there is no way not to lean when a field is present. The Sun keeps the main hold. Mars adds its curve. Phobos and Deimos annotate. The thin upper air waits at its altitude like a delicate net that does not move to meet what falls toward it, only exists where it exists. The numbers that describe it all, mu, v infinity, r, p, e, I, omega, omega, f, are dry if you stare, but they're also a language of inevitability that once spoken turns into motion without friction, into a meeting that will take place wherever the sums cross zero, into an approach that tightens hour by hour as angles become distances, and distances become seconds, and seconds become the moment when the path and the planet are the same place at the same time, while the quiet pull keeps writing, and the curve keeps deepening, and the loom of gravity continues its work without haste. The first molecules it meets are lone wanderers themselves, drifting high above the red world where air is more a suggestion than a promise. One by one they tap the leading face of the newcomer and rebound, trading energy for a whisper of heat. Then 2 by 2, then a crowd, altitude falls. The thin exosphere thickens into something that can be felt, and feeling becomes friction, and friction becomes light. Seen from the night side, it begins as a pearl where no pearl belonged, a small insistence in the dark that grows a soft haze. From orbit it looks like a needle scratch on a lacquered disc, brightening by degrees. The bow shock snaps into being in front of the onrushing body, a thin veil where carbon dioxide is struck dumb by speed, compressed and heated until it glows. There is no roar allowed because the air is too spare to carry it far, but inside the physics the roar is total. Atoms rattled into new arrangements, electrons shaken up and then falling back, giving off their tiny pulses of colour. The line of flight writes itself as a luminous thread, and the planet's edge answers with a faint electric halo. The leading surface of 3i Atlas warms faster than language can follow. Heat does not pool, it shears. The flow is hypersonic by a wild margin, and in such flow the world ahead is a wedge that air must split around. The shock sits a palm's breadth off the surface, storing energy in a thin, furious cushion. Ablation begins where the cushion licks hardest, fragile crust bubbling then vaporizing into a storm of molecules that rush backward and become part of the tail. Pieces as fine as ash and as large as beads surrender, each taking away heat as it leaves, each making the shape a little rounder, a little more honest about what it must endure. Instruments far above tune to the passage. One orbiter listens for a spike in free electrons, the sudden ion trail that turns a slice of sky into a short-lived mirror for radio waves. Another looks for the high-altitude blink of nitric oxides, the faint chemistry of shock and heat in a carbon dioxide sky. Accelerometers in the warm belly of a craft already circling Mars feel a tremor in the drag regime, a change in the upper air's density where the newcomer has stirred it. Numbers tick up, tick down, write their quiet testimony to the moment when a stone from a different star crosses a planet's first skin. Below, the air grows denser by the Martian standards, which is to say it begins to act like a crowd instead of a rumour. Dynamic pressure rises in lockstep with speed and density, the simple arithmetic that decides whether even a solid body keeps its poise. 3i Atlas is not a monolith. It is a laced-together relic made of ice, dust and stone compacted by deep cold and long dark. Small jets of vapour that were polite in deep space become irrelevant here. The flow dominates, slamming every irregularity flat with invisible hands. The body tries to keep its attitude, then tumbles, then finds a new attitude that minimises pain. That is what aerodynamics does, even to something that never intended to be an aircraft. Lift in such a regime is a rumour, drag is law. A faint shedding becomes a snow becomes gravel. Somewhere along the path the sum of tiny weaknesses, old cracks filled with ancient frost, seams where dust never quite fused, meets the rising push of the wind, and the arithmetic stops balancing. The traveller does not explode in the way fiction loves. It loosens. It peels. Panels of crust, meters wide, lever off and flash, bright in their brief independence. The main body shrugs and tightens into a smaller, rounder core. Far behind, the trail of fragments writes a dotted sentence across the sky, punctuation rolling and bright, each dot fading by slow degrees. Mars is not a loud place, but where the train passes low enough, sound has weight. A shallow angle entry draws a soft, unrolling thunder across empty basins, a pressure wave that flexes the thin air like a drumhead and then relaxes it again. The wave travels on, scattering dust from dune crests, hustling frost crystals in the lee of rocks. Rovers that happen to be listening measure a breath that does not belong to the day's weather. A tide that came and went once and will not come again in quite the same way. At the leading edges of the fragments, surfaces turn molten and then tear away as droplets that freeze in the slipstream, each a seed of future dust. The colour is not like Earth's meteors. It has a paler, coppered heart, the signature of carbon dioxide chemistry in thin air. The train spans altitudes, bright heads higher than the tallest volcano, embering pieces lower where the air can finally assert itself. The wake behind the main core corrugates, rolls, tightens, turbulent eddies braid and unbraid in silence, leaving ghosts that fade to nothing in seconds. Lower still, the atmosphere acts like weather instead of theory. The entry path carves through layers that had their own business. A faint noctilucent sheet of ice crystals, a streamer of sand lifted hours earlier from a crater floor, a mountain wave rising and falling invisibly over a shield volcano's flank. Where the incandescent heads cut these layers, they leave interruptions, holes punched in clouds that heal almost at once, curls that twist the dust sheet into temporary calligraphy. For a breath of time, a blue sunset band glows with a second illumination from above, as if a new sun were writing across it with a pin. Inside the fragments, at what remains of the core, pressure climbs further. The thin shell of altered material, heated, then quenched, then heated again, can no longer keep the interior's story quiet. Volatiles flash and vent. Cracks find each other like old friends and join hands. Another shedding occurs, harder and faster. Brightness surges. From orbit, the curve of the path shows a kink where mass dropped suddenly, and drag rose, bending the trajectory a shade steeper. Prediction plots on screens back home update and settle with new confidence. The corridor of possibility narrows as physics becomes fact. Interactions multiply at the scale of pebbles now. Each fragment, however small, is writing its own entry in the book of descent. A tiny bow shock, a tiny wake, a tiny trail of ionized air. Some are slowed so much that they will go dark in high air and drift in the wind as heated stones, cooling towards the surface. Some will stay hot and fast, punching deeper, briefly reigniting where density kicks up along a slope, then dimming again. The track below crosses regions with different characters. Dust-choked plains, crater rims, the shoulder of a valley whose air is slightly denser, for being lower than its surroundings. Every kilometre alters the balance by just enough for a few more pieces to change their fate. Light from the train flickers long shadows. Dunes throw thin blades that wobble as if alive. Boulder fields breathe dark and light in a slow pulse as the wake glows past. On cold rock faces, frost crystals sublimating at dawn are swept aside by the passing pressure wave, exposing darker patches that will warm faster when the sun reaches them later. Even in a world so sparse, heat spills down in a way that leaves fingerprints subtle, temporary, real, the glow teaches. Spectrometers tuned to the sky pick out lines in the light. Sodium from dust, oxygen from torn molecules, faint signatures from metals hidden in the traveller's silt. From these, the story of the material unrolls in numbers. How porous, how strong, how ancient by the ratio of one isotope to another. The shape of the light curve, how fast it rises, how long it lingers, tells about grain size and cohesion. In the slim time that the body spends incandescent, it confesses more than it had in all the long dark between stars. And still the air thickens by Mars's measure, the scale height stepping the density up in quiet multiples. Flow that was attached becomes separated at the shoulders of the bigger chunks, wakes ballooning. Some pieces begin to tumble end over end, bright dark, a lighthouse rhythm that quickens as drag steals away speed. Others stabilize into blunt flight, a bell shape that is heat's favourite because it spreads the pain, melting and boiling trade places across a few centimetres of depth. Glass skins form and shatter and form again. Phobos, hurrying on its tight leash, watches from above as a brief moving star crosses beneath it, while Deimos, farther out and slower, sees a longer glimmer that creeps toward the limb of the planet and then sinks. To those small moons, this is weather, a rare cloud of light. To the orbiters, it is a planned event with planned manoeuvres, a roll to keep the plasma instruments forward, a slit turned toward the trail, a buffer cleared in time to catch the spike. To the ground, it is a passing brightness, as impersonal as dawn. Where the path brushes a banked layer of dust-laden air, the shock skirt ruffles. A filament peels off and curls like smoke that isn't smoke. Cold CO2 vapour condenses behind the brighter nodes, forming hypersonic contrails of crystal that wink out in the shape of invisible vortices. In the largest fragment's lee, pressure drops just enough to draw a momentary fog, a ghost teardrop that clings and then evaporates as the fragment descends toward the thicker strata. The angle matters. A shallow path spends long minutes in punishment, trading speed for altitude line by line. A steeper path makes decisions in seconds, compressing the whole education of entry into a shout of light. 3I Atlas arrived with its angle set long ago by sums of tiny forces and one large geometry. That angle now chooses the altitudes where each fragment goes brightest, chooses which pieces will ride far downrange and which will surrender their heat and come to rest sooner. The ground beneath does not vote, but it will receive the results. Plasma clings to the nearest air like a skin of bright water. Around the largest surviving core, the sheath thickens until it acts like a radio cloak, shutting out communications for anything unlucky enough to be within it. There is no craft inside this sheath, only rock, but the effect is the same, a region where signals refract and die. Downrange, the sheath thins and opens again as the light dims, clearing a path through which orbiters will see the afterglow in ultraviolet for a breath longer than human eyes can. Up in the flow, tiny ripples on the fragment's surface become faults. Faults become flutes, flutes gouge channels where molten material streams backward and hardens into ridges that will last for as long as the piece lasts. The largest ridges can steer the flow just enough to bias the fragment into a stable orientation. Blunt end forward, tail streaming straight back, a firefly made of rock and equations. The brightness steadies. The path tightens its curve toward lower air with the patience of simple mechanics. Behind, the trail thins to spark and ash. Ahead, the air that has not yet been touched waits at its densities and temperatures and winds, indifferent. The red ground holds its shapes, terraced crater walls, rippled ergs, scalloped scarps, receiving a shifting, wavering light that passes over and leaves them as it found them, except for the dust that has been lifted, the frost that has been kissed away, the new warmth that rides a meter down into the regolith before it will quietly leak back into the cold. The arc bends a little more, and the luminous heads descend across the invisible lines, where the sky's thin layers change names and habits without ceremony, each fragment carrying its own small weather as it pushes through. Contact is not a single instant. It is a stack of instants folded together so tightly they behave like one. The first touch is a transfer, velocity becoming pressure, pressure becoming shock. Rock that had been minding its own deep-time business meets, rock that has been travelling for ages, and both forget what quiet means. The face of the largest surviving core of 3I Atlas presses into the ground at tens of kilometres per second, and for a hair width of time, the materials are neither solid, liquid, nor gas, but a dense, obedient crowd that moves however the shock tells it to move. A hemisphere of pressure forms and races ahead as it. into the crust faster than sound can consider catching up. The incoming body begins to stop without breaking. It is unmade as it goes, its substance converted into heat, melt, vapor, and fragments that no longer remember their prior shapes. The surface at the point of contact caves, then rebounds, then caves again. An oscillation so brief you could stack 1,000 of them inside a heartbeat and still have room for a sigh. Around the point, the ground flows radially in a sheet, first down and then up, carving a bowl that deepens even as its rim rises, lifting blocks the size of auditoriums as if they were soft clay. Obliquity rights its asymmetry. The incoming path is not straight down, it leans. Downrange, the rim grows lower and broader, the ejector blanket thins into a long tongue, and uprange the rim is abrupt, stepped, and proud. In that first bright instant, the plume is a torch angled with the trajectory. Its core a white-hot mix of vaporized rock and volatiles lofted skyward, its sheath a storm of melt droplets, glass beads, and pulverized dust that will cool on the way up and come back as a soft, stony rain. The air, thin as it is, matters. It catches the smallest grains and drags them sideways, kneading the plume into curls and sheets that begin to forget the exact vector of arrival and remember instead the winds aloft. Underfoot, the excavation stage flowers. The shock front drills down in a widening bell, then weakens and leaves behind a pressure distribution that lifts the center, making room for the cavity to grow. Cones of fractured rock, shatter cones, sprout in orientations that will later look like frozen ripples, oriented to the passing of the shock. A ring of normal faults forms around the growing bowl, and great slabs slump toward the center, in slow motion by comparison to the shock. Seconds after milliseconds, still very fast, still sculptural. The transient crater, deeper and narrower than the final form, reaches its brief maximum, walls oversteepened, floor still falling. Rebound begins as the mass of crushed, heated rock beneath the center pushes up like the surface of water after a stone is dropped. On Mars, where gravity is kinder than Earth's, that rebound can rise to form a central peak or even a central peak ring, depending on the size of the event and the competence of the layers below. Here, the uplift swells like a fist under a blanket. Melt pools above it and then pours away toward low places, slick and incandescent, threading around falling wall blocks. The modification stage takes hold. Terraces collapse into graceful stair-stepped arcs. The rim slumps outward and then stabilizes. The cavity trades depth for width and finds its equilibrium in a shape that looks inevitable after it exists. Everything thrown out finds a place. Closest to the rim, the ejector lands as low-bait sheets, their edges curled into ramparts by the ground-hugging flows that form when hot fragments plow into thin air and drag it along as a base surge. Farther out, larger clasts fall ballistically, punching small divots that align in downrange chains, secondary craters that tell the tale of their parent like children with the same eyes. Farthest, dust settles as a quiet veil over dunes, over old crater rims, over rover tracks, over the dormant shoulders of ancient volcanoes. The thickness decays with distance, the pattern remembers the wind. The whole planet receives a measure, tiny here, generous there. The plume climbs, its luminous core dims from white to copper to ember as expansion steals heat and the mixture separates into phases. Vapor at the top melt mid-height, ash and sand below. Within it, droplets of rock, spherules freeze into glass as they spin, their surfaces striated by flow, their insides holding bubbles like breath. Some will burst in the cold and scatter as shards, some will land whole and roll into small hollows, beads tucked into the wrinkles of the land. Tiny pieces of the incoming body are there too, altered beyond pride but present. Minerals that formed around another sun, now quenched in Martian glass. A ring wave runs through the crust, a seismic breath that circles the planet. In the near field, the ground hops and shudders. Farther away, it sways with a long, almost dignified period. Instruments that have waited for years for a sharp signal receive it, a rising onset, a high-frequency chatter that damps into a low, patient hum. Some of that energy will focus at the antipodes, or P, where the waves meet and add, stirring dust on cliffs no one will see, and unsettling talus on slopes that have been comfortable for centuries. The recorders write their lines in clear ink. Later, when people back home read them, they will know the depths and speeds and the way layers under the red world respond when struck. The thin atmosphere takes the pressure wave and translates it into weather. A front of compressed air races outward along the surface, lifting dust from every stony edge and drawing frost into short-lived vortices that glitter if the sun happens to be low. The shocks leading face lofts a dense sheet that behaves like a fluid hugging the ground, curling around obstacles, climbing low scarps, breaking like surf where it meets ripples in the terrain. Where that sheet passes over older dust, it scours. Where it passes over bare rock, it paints, spraying melt and ash in fans that point back to the new centre, compass true. Inside the crater, incandescent rain continues. Melt spatters build hooded shapes on the windward sides of blocks, drape roofs over voids, and coalesce into tongues that freeze with skins that craze as they cool, revealing the contraction maps of their own loss of heat. Vesicles, gas bubbles, rise within those tongues and become trapped, the bubbles stretching and aligning with flow, elongate beads that will whistle if tapped. The central uplift, having reached higher than comfort, begins to subside, cracking into radial and concentric faults that step down toward the middle. The floor is a mosaic, panels rotated a few degrees from their neighbours, joints still hot enough to soften rather than snap. Fragments of 3I Atlas that survive deep entry arrive a beat later, under their own arcs, as incandescent punctuation. Some strike inside the evolving crater and vanish into the melt, sending fat, round ripples across the glowing surface. Others tag the rim, knocking fresh bites from it, and adding small aprons of their own ejector, little commas around the edge of the new bowl. The distribution remains biased downrange. Oblique arrivals carry their conviction with them even when broken. In the uprange sector, shadowed by the rim's higher scarp, the blanket is thicker and more continuous, smooth where the flows stayed coherent, rough where they shed blocks like icebergs. Chemical conversations ignite in the heat. Carbon dioxide splits and recombines, oxygen meets metals hungry for it. Water locked as hydrates in the crust flashes to steam and is gone into the plume or condenses later as rime along the coolest corners of boulders newly exposed. Sulfates desiccate and then take up thin films again as temperatures fall through their favoured ranges. Iron is everywhere in Mars's skin, and here it shifts oxidation states like a mood. The colours that will remain when everything cools are written in those changes, subtle variations on red and brown and a grey that looks almost blue in the hour before dawn. From orbit, the growth can be seen in the cadence of seconds. Cameras sweep and then pivot back, catching the rim's progress as successive terraces fail and fall inward, each failure clouding the cavity with a fresh puff that escapes over the low downrange wall and is pressed flat by the fast-moving air at altitude. Thermal imagers see the world in brightness, temperatures, a disk of white at the centre, a corona of orange, a long downwind smear that cools from yellow to green as it thins. Ultraviolet instruments pick out the signatures of excited molecules. Infrared spectrometers taste the rock as vapour and melt, confess the minerals they used to be. Ridges beyond the crater feel the ground wave as a shrug. A precarious boulder balanced longer than memory rolls 1/4 turn and settles with a new view. In a nearby dune sea, slip faces avalanche as the airfront pulls the crest forward. Fresh ripples form at the dune toes, sharp and delicate until the next breeze rounds them. In a cold gully, frostline sinks down by a hand's breadth as warm ash lands. Hours later, the same frost will climb back up as the warmth leaks away, and the thin night builds itself again from breath and shadow. Where the rim is highest, blocks stack into buttresses whose faces are scratched by striations, gouges made by other blocks dragged past during collapse. Slicken sides on those faces gleam briefly, then dust settles and the gleam is gone. At the base of the scarp, Tellus collects, fresh, angular, untravelled. Between the scarp and the central structures, the floor is softly cratered by fallback of larger clasts. Each of those small bowls has its own ring of rays, its own minute pattern of ejecta, superimposed on the larger pattern like notes played in harmony. Not all the energy went into digging and lifting. Some went into melting deep pockets. Those will cool last, insulated by the rubble above. In them, crystals will grow as the hours pass, first tiny acicular needles, then broader lathes, then interlocking frameworks as chemistry and cooling rate bargain. When the roof over such a pocket collapses days or weeks later, it will reveal frozen flow bandings and aligned crystals that point the way the liquid once moved. Even now, convection rolls in the largest melt pond, hot sheets sinking, cooler sheets rising at the edges, the whole surface quilting into polygons that widen and crack as tension finds a path. The plume, still rising, begins to forget its source. At its margins, entrainment wins. The thin Martian air is pulled in, mixed, warmed, accelerated outward. A gravity current forms and races away along the surface as a dilute, far-reaching haze. Embedded in that haze are the finest things, sub-micron grains that will take days to settle unless the winds herd them into lee sides and hollows. These will be the makers of soft twilights, the artists of far horizons, the reason evening will hold on a little longer in latitudes that did not witness the strike. Phobos's quick orbit carries it across the expanding umbrella of dust and vapour. Particles strike its surface like thinnest rain, adding an invisible layer to a place already accustomed to gentle accretion. Deimos, slower and more distant, intersects the tail's highest, faintest skirt later. The encounter is a rumour there, a few extra specks that will vanish into its old regolith. Between them, the orbital paths pick up a temporary tracery of particles that will either spiral inward to Mars under drag from the gas still expanding, or spiral outward under sunlight's patient push, joining the planet's invisible transient rings of disturbance. Back on the fresh rim, a single block stands alone, casting a shadow sharp enough to slice the glow that still seeps from the floor below. Its top is frosted with impact glass, a varnish that reflects the pale sun when it returns and keeps the block cooler than its neighbours for a day or two. Cracks in that varnish follow hexagons and pentagons, cooling figures that rhyme with shapes frozen on lava lakes on other worlds. A fragment of the three-eye atlas the size of a fist sits fused in that glass like a fly in amber, its minerals shocked into new arrangements, tiny diamonds perhaps in the carbon-rich pockets where pressures peaked and then fled. Around the basin, the air is thicker than it was an hour ago, but only in comparison to nothing. It carries a smell that no nose will ever register, a mingling of rock vapour, fine ash, and the sharp, clean cold of carbon dioxide that has kissed heat and is remembering how to be itself again. The pressure wave that ran ahead has flattened dunes for a few kilometres and then lost interest. The base surge has left scalloped edges on fresh lobes of ejecta that now sit inert, waiting for wind to comb them into whatever shapes the next season favours. The last incandescent clasts fall, fewer and farther between, small streaks that burn and go out and drop as warm stones that tick into the dust and lie there, cooling. Surfaces already begin to record the new weather of the new topography. On the uprange inner wall, little rockfalls continue as oversteepened cuts sort themselves out. On the downrange exterior apron, the ground-hugging cloud has left lineations, delicate streamers from some frozen into place, that point the direction of flow with a cartographer's certainty. The central uplift's crown shows radial cracks that will collect frost tonight before anywhere else. The meltsheet surface, still soft where it is thickest, carries the paw prints of falling blocks that stuck for a moment and then sank, leaving only rounded hollows where they disappeared. In the deep fractures beneath the basin, fluids find paths that did not exist earlier. In the day, a pocket of ancient ice flashes to steam where a fracture tip races through, pressure venting into the cavity until the tip passes and the rock reclamps, sealing the vapour into a bubble in the melt above. Salts dissolve in transient films along hot joints and then are left high and dry as the heat goes by, recrystallising into rinds that will brighten a little under the sun for a time and then dust over into anonymity. The shock has reset clocks everywhere it went. Minerals that were comfortable now hold strain. Some will relax by creeping and some by cracking with the next small quake that ambles through. And above it all, the sky, altered but itself, holds the tall column like a growing ghost, brighter at the base, thinning upward into a pale, spreading anvil that drifts with high winds toward the limb, its edge feathering into streamers that begin to blend with the planet's old patient hazes. The light along that edge already beginning to change the colour of afternoon a little earlier than it would have, a faint veil that will make shadows gentler even far from the basin, the suspended grains learning the paths the air prefers, and the air in turn learning the shape and weight of the new dust it has been asked to carry, while the ground under the column ticks and settles and the rim holds its breath between one small rockfall and the next. Dust learns the sky the way water learns a riverbed, by drifting, settling and rising again when something unseen says now. In the days after the strike, particles lifted from the basin and from the long downrange apron begin to sort themselves by size and by the winds they meet. The largest settle quickly, sketching faint, tawny fans over ridges and craters nearby. The smallest are the patient ones. They take the high roads, up into the thin, cold heights where the atmosphere becomes a hymn rather than a conversation. There, sunlight turns them gentle, and they respond by changing light itself. Mars already wears dust the way a book wears age, softly everywhere, but this new veil is fresh and fine. The daytime sky, which was a mild butterscotch yesterday, becomes a little denser, a little milkier. Shadows grow shallower at noon, as if the sun has learned to speak in a quieter voice. Through the hours, that voice shifts. Light scatters more than it used to, forward in a way that sharpens the glow around the sun and smooths the rest of the dome. When evening comes, something delicate happens at the horizon. A narrow band of blue emerges, not Earth's ocean blue, but a cool ribbon, as if a secret has been pulled out of the air and held up against the fading day. Fine dust does that here, bending red light around itself and letting the shorter blues pass through the haze and collect near the setting sun, painting twilight with a tone that doesn't quite belong and yet feels native. Far above, thin clouds test their outlines. The high, icy veils that sometimes trail the afternoon now carry scatterings of new grains. They take on an inner brightness that lasts a few minutes longer than it should, the particles catching the last rays after the ground has turned to evening. At the limb, where space begins, a faint line appears like the edge of a coin, an aureole that orbits with the planet's slow spin, tinted by dust that has climbed to heights where wind ceases to be weather and becomes a tide. The veil has layers. Closest to the ground, the air holds a near-invisible sea of grains that lift and fall with the daily breathing of the atmosphere. As morning warming begins, thermals stir, raising filaments that look like nothing until you watch them change the way the light falls on a single rock. By afternoon, those filaments can join into sheets, and the sheets into local storms. No drama, just a thickening that shortens the distance you can see. Above that, another layer rides the slope, winds off ancient volcanoes and the flanks of basins, a conveyor that carries dust down slope at night and upslope by day. Higher still, a dusty stratum sweeps around the planet like a slow-moving equator of mist, guided by jets that no one can feel from the ground, but that leave signatures in the way sunsets begin a heartbeat earlier in one direction than another. As it travels, dust rubs against dust. Grains charge and discharge. In thicker gusts, tiny sparks snap in silence, too small to flash across the sky, large enough to make grain stick that might have fallen. Aggregates form, little open clusters of particles that are light for their size and thus stubborn about settling. They hang, drifting, making the sky softer, tugged by sunlight, pushed by the patient push of photons and by the less patient shove of a passing front that has borrowed its energy from the day. Ridges and dunes become instruments for this new weather. On the windward faces, ripples sharpen, crests darken, as coarser grains are laid bare. On the lee sides, drifts billow like the skirts of sleeping giants, catching the slow rain of the finest particles and stacking them into layers delicate enough to be brushed away by a sigh. In small alcoves, a silky crust forms overnight, dust welded by a whisper of frost and light into a wafer that shatters at the touch of the next breeze. Each morning breaks it, each afternoon lays it down again. The cycle writes itself into millimeters, then erases itself and starts over without complaint. Twilight stretches, not simply because the sun takes a certain time to sink, but because the sky has learned to glow from within. After the sun kisses the horizon, the high dust still holds the day and drips it slowly into the dark. The ground cools and the air above it becomes a little stiller, and lines appear, a bright, mild triangle rising from the western horizon, and in the east, a shadowed band that looks like a slow wave. The triangle lingers longer now, coloured by dust into a pale saffron that fades upward into a greyer tan, with that thin, improbable blue at its heart. Stars wake into this light with patience. The first appear not at zenith, but near the darker edges, and then the rest thread themselves into the veil, less crisp than before, as if seen through fine silk. The planet's breath, its thermal tide, plays with the veil on a schedule it has kept for eons. Pressure rises a little in the afternoon, and again around midnight, falls through morning and evening. Dust rides those tides the way boats ride a lake's slow cycle. At some hours, the higher layer thickens audibly in the instruments and invisibly to the eye. At others, it thins just enough to reveal a darker limb, a sharper line around the world when seen from space. Orbiters draw maps of this change in invisible ink, columns of extinction, optical depths that step up and down with the passing of the tide, with the warming and cooling of ground that can no longer see the sun but still remembers it. In some regions, the added haze makes the air seem closer. Horizons fade a shade, craters at a distance hide their rims until the last minute of approach. The sun's disk grows woolly, its edge less defined, its colour drifting toward pale amber, even at midday. When the wind pauses, a rare gift, the world takes on a hush that is deeper than quiet. Dust that had been in motion settles with a collective decision you cannot hear. Stones breathe out their heat. The dune slip face holds itself perfectly, then lets go along a sharp line with a single low sigh, and grain by grain the slope resets to the angle it prefers, all in the softness lent by the veil. At night the veil chills. Grains radiate into space as efficiently as any small thing can. Those that hang high become the last to cool, and so they glow longest in thermal eyes. Those near the ground cool quickest and invite frost to condense on them in hair-thin films. The dawn breeze will lift that frost as vapour, and with it lift the grains themselves. Easier now to move than they were yesterday, easier to carry into the low places where they will be folded into the land's longer stories. On cliff faces, faint streaks darken as frost retreats, outlining the paths where dust has just moved and will move again tomorrow. Seasonal handwriting rewritten by breath and light. The dust does not travel alone. Along its way it gathers and releases gases, salts, the tiniest shards of glass formed in the brief furnace where 3I Atlas shook the ground into brightness. Each grain becomes a messenger, a surface with room for a film of water, a few molecules thick, a corner where sunlight can split a bond and then allow it to reform differently, a place where electricity can briefly live and then leak away into the air. Chemistry rides with weather, and the two of them together tint the day. A lone boulder on a ridge becomes a clock for the new sky. In the morning, its shadow is clean. At noon, the shadow shortens and softens, its edge furrowing where light is scattered into the place the shadow expects to be. In the afternoon, the boulder's windward face grows paler as fine grains salt it, while its leeward pocket darkens, a small reservoir of quiet where dust can rest. After sunset, that pocket gathers frost before the open ground does, the extra grains offering more surface for cold to hold. The frost line climbs the boulder and then retreats, leaving a skin that will vanish when the first light strikes but will matter for a few hours to anything small that depends on shade and stillness. Sometimes the veil tightens into something more assertive. A local storm lifts above the new crater and strides outward, its head glowing softly where sunlight finds the densest part of the column. The edges feather, the base blurs, and the storm discovers craters and channels as it goes, pouring into them, breaking around them, leaving them powdered. If it grows enough, it meets another wandering veil, and they fold together like hands, becoming something larger that will cross half a hemisphere and then spend itself. If it remains a provincial thing, it will polish only its own landscape and then thin into the general haze, a personality dissolving back into a mood. In the thin, high places where air is little more than intention, the veil speaks the language of light with more fluency than the ground does. There, the aureole around the sun changes shape from hour to hour, brightening and narrowing when grains are smallest and most uniform, widening and dimming when they are larger or clumped. Halo-like forms appear, not the ice halos of Earth, but cousins, forward-scattered brightnesses that engineers and scientists can dissect into sizes and shapes by the way they fade with angle. Those sizes and shapes drift over days as the population of grains evolves. Aggregation here, fragmentation there, sedimentation everywhere the wind allows. On the far side of the planet from the basin, sunset is altered even though the ground has not seen new ash. The air there has caught its own share by slow circulation. Evening's palette moderates. Stars take longer to win their way through. A rover that has been dutifully sipping sunlight through its panels notices the difference without caring for poetry. The current falls by a margin that matters, and it husbands its tasks accordingly. An orbiter sees this shift like a pulse around the world and writes it down as numbers that will later be read as weather that followed an impact, as the planet's way of holding new dust in the crook of its arm and then letting it go. On some dawns, when the sun climbs and the cold surface releases its brief clutch on the air, the veil becomes visible as horizontal sheets that detach from the land and lift, a staircase of haze steps ascending the slopes of old volcanoes and the walls of long canyons. Each step climbs, thins, and merges with the next above it, until the sky is smooth again, as if someone has run a fingertip along its surface to erase the lines. In those minutes, the horizon is a thing made by hand, stratified and careful, and then it relaxes into its ordinary generosity. The planet's small moons become dimmer as they cross the bright parts of the veil. Phobos, hurrying, dips in and out of zones of higher dust and blinks, slight, measurable against the starfield. Deimos slides through a softer glow and emerges a little quieter. These are small effects, but they are ways of seeing the veil without looking at the sun or at the ground. Even the shadows the moons cast, thin, racing, gain a blur they did not have last week, their edges feathering on the slopes where they pass in the minutes before dawn or after dusk. Day by day, gravity auditions every grain. Fall or float, drift or land. The smallest persist, the middle ones hesitate, the largest concede. Winds nudge the undecided toward basins and lee sides. Some of the finest never find the ground near where they were born. Sunlight will persuade them to new orbits, gentle spirals that walk them outward until a different season, a different tilt, a different tide draws them down. The rest will become part of surfaces, a micron's thick finish on a rock, a thin film along a fracture, a fresh layer in the book of a dune, a brightness tucked into the crease of a terrace that did not exist before the day when light became dust and dust became sky. And when night returns again, the blue band at the horizon remembers to bloom even if no one is there to watch. The high veil cradles the last light as if it were the rim of a bowl, and the stars fill the spaces between the grains, the way thoughts fill the spaces between breaths, while the air waits for the next small change in heat and the next small climb in wind, and the veil, still learning its new routes, lifts in one place and settles in another, with the unhurried certainty of a world practicing how to wear a new thin garment of light. Heat moves through the ground in slow, patient waves, and the first thing it finds is ice. Not the glossy slabs of winter lakes, but a patchwork of frost locked into soil, tiny crystals filling pores, thin lenses tucked between grains like secret panes of glass. When the shock from the strike has passed, and the light has dulled from white to ember, the warmth lingers and wanders downward, following fractures it helped to open. In those narrow spaces, the ice remembers how to be water, then forgets again, flashing to vapour because the pressure is too low for comfort. It is a cycle spoken in moments: ice to liquid to steam, back to ice against a colder wall, all along a corridor of rock that only just learned exists. Here and there the pathways widen into pockets, and pockets soften into chambers. Melt collects in these temporary rooms, clear and shy, threaded with tiny bubbles that form and run to the surface and break with no sound. The liquid is not pure. Martian soil is generous with salts, perchlorates, sulfates, chlorides, and these join the melt like old friends, lowering the temperature at which water can remain a liquid, letting it linger longer than it ought to under this thin skin. Along the chamber walls, grains swell and slake, clays drink and change, iron trades its coat for another and back again, trying on colours that the cooling dark will fix into place. Steam finds vents, some are hair-thin and weave sideways, others are sudden and straight, little chimneys driven by heat and the simple need to escape. Around each vent, a ring of rime appears where vapour quarrels with cold, ice feathers that grow backward into the flow, delicate as eyelashes, doomed to sublimate when the next breath of warm air passes. In spots where the venting is fierce, ice cannot form, so salts crystallise instead, soft, pale blooms left behind as the last microlighters boil off. The patterns are map-like, as if the ground is sketching its plumbing for anyone who cares to read. Closer to the surface, the warmth writes faster. A metre down, hardpan softens into a dark mud that never quite becomes liquid in the terrestrial sense but solids all the same, a syrup of dust and water and ions that moves along layers the way a card moves along a felt table. It noses toward low places, small troughs, shadowed lee sides, the foot of a terrace newly slumped into the crater. Where it reaches daylight, it darkens the surface and then goes bright with frost as evaporative cold steals heat in an instant. A lace of polygon cracks forms around the stain, shrinking patterns that look like handwriting from a language the planet used long before anyone listened. By night the basin exhales. Heat stored in rocks all afternoon lifts carbon dioxide a few inches off the ground and carries it outward like a ground-hugging tide. Water vapour rides with it. On ridgelines that vapour condenses as hoarfrost, a glittering rind that picks out every edge and seam. In hollows, a low fog pools so thin it might be mistaken for a trick of light, were it not for the way it erases small features and softens the shadows of things no taller than a chair. The fog glows at dawn for a few long breaths, then climbs the slope and breaks into invisible strands that braid themselves into the morning wind. The crater's floor becomes a patchwork of warmth and cold, wet and dry, in a dance too slow for eyes to see, but perfect for instruments. The thickest melt sheets keep their heat longest. Their surfaces congeal into glassy plains while their interiors stay soft, convecting in sluggish rolls that renew the skin from below. Along their margins, where the sheet thins, vein-like channels appear, the product of liquid that was liquid only in the most patient sense, creeping along jagged paths until the night arrested it. These veins hold a brighter frost after sunset, then darken first at dawn, like delicate capillaries in the skin of a sleeping thing. Everywhere the air meets fresh glass and shocked rock, chemistry becomes busy. Surfaces that have not seen air for millions of years suddenly present themselves. Sulfur becomes a traveller between states. Iron wears a suite of oxides. Silica leans towards gels and then toward opal-like skins where water lingered for an hour and left. In the smallest crevices, hydrated minerals begin to form, smectites and other clays that speak of brief warmth and a gift of water. Not enough to last. Enough to write a note and stick it under a stone where a future rover's arm might someday reach. Steam explosions, small and impulsive, pock the apron downrange. A lens of ice too near the surface meets a tongue of heat and flashes, kicking a thin slurry into the air that lands as a ring of mud splats and pebbly beads. Each ring is a transient volcano made of cold, a raised lip, a shallow bowl, a starburst of streaks where droplets skidded and froze. The rings accumulate in fields, overlapping like raindrops on a pond, their geometry hinting at the unseen pattern of buried ice, the way tree rings hint at weather no one remembers. Where the surge swept groundward in that first hour, it left levees of fine ash along the margins of short-lived flows. Those levees are good at catching melt. In the afternoon, when the surface is warmest, the ash permits a thin film to run along its base, no thicker than a fingernail moving, centimetres and then millimetres before the slope ends or the shade begins and the film arrests, mirrored thread caught in amber. Under magnification, small bridges of ice form between grains at the edges of these films, menisci that strengthen and then vanish, a frozen architecture rehearsed and dismantled daily. The ground remembers cold vividly, even as warmth travels inward. Layers just beyond the front retain their ancient brittleness. Fractures initiated by the shock propagate there, and when these fractures intersect with melt-lined conduits, they give the liquid new choices. Sometimes that choice is to stay. A pocket will seal and become a lens again, refreezing from the edges inward, a pale coin in a dark purse. Sometimes it is to move, to seep toward a slope, making it slick enough that a few square meters of regolith let go and slide quietly downslope, leaving behind a gullied crescent that darkens for a day, then lightens as the salts effloresce. There are moments when the thin air is briefly thick in the mouth of a vent, not with gas but with crystals. Water vapour, sprinting from a hot fracture, meets air cold enough to demand a phase change, and the demand is met by snow, dry, grainy glitter. It falls not as Earth's flakes, but as tiny prisms and plates that land and bounce and stick, according to rules written by temperature and chance. The fall lasts for minutes and leaves a bright ring around the vent, a hoard that sublimates over the next hour into nothing you would notice from a distance, yet it changed how this square metre of ground melted tomorrow. From orbit, a halo appears around the basin in certain wavelengths, a darkening in the near-infrared, where hydrated minerals announce themselves, brightening in thermal bands where the glass and fresh rock hold a different heat than the old dust. Within that halo, patches flicker with a diurnal rhythm, darker in the middle of the day when films flow or soak, lighter after frost blooms at night, a heartbeat you could graph. The pattern stretches downwind, braided by topography, interrupted by crater rims that cast long morning shadows where ice lasts longer, rewoven by afternoons when slope winds run like cool water down the flanks. In the deep structure, rock has been shocked into polymorphs that tell anyone who listens about pressures and durations. Quartz where there was none before, feldspars pressed into new habits, glass trapped with tiny bubbles whose ratios speak of steam's brief empire. Those bubbles line up in bands that point towards source and direction like arrows. Some bubbles hold a trace of the traveller itself, minerals from 3I Atlas that endured, now fused into Martian melt, each a relic of a different neighbourhood under a different star, sharing a matrix with basalt born of this world. Time here has learned two tempos. The first is fast, the racing hours-long dialogue of ice and heat. The second is slow, the days into weeks settling glissando where the residual warmth diffuses outward and downward, lowering frost lines by centimetres, not kilometres, shifting phase boundaries along a path as calm as a tide. In the slow tempo, larger stories emerge. A terrace that yields stone by stone until its face reclines to a comfortable angle. A slump that advances stepwise, each night gaining a few grains, each noon locking them with evaporite crusts. A delicate fan at the mouth of a notch that grows by millimetres, arrayed as if someone had combed it. On the crater's shadowed inner walls, cold traps accumulate treasure. The new dust is brightest there, salted with ice that lingers most of the day. In those traps, any vapour that wanders in at night will stay, condensing as films too thin to see that nevertheless move ions from one grain to another. Writing faint hats of gypsum here, a skim of chlorides there, crusts that will survive in shade for a season, and then break when the sun creeps into the niche again, and whispers that all things should move. There are places where the heat made something like a spring, though spring is not the right word here, because pressure does not pool in the old Earth way. Instead, a fracture network opened, and a brine decided to explore it, creeping upward along a stress alley, and arriving at the surface in a place already weak, already waiting. The brine beaded, spread a palm's breadth, etched a thin line as it retreated. The residue it left, salt, dust bound into a crust, tightened the surface enough that the next wind passed over it without raising grains. A dark streak grew by absence of motion rather than presence of wet, and then it faded later, a ghost of an hour of flow. When dawn light hits the basin at a shallow angle, it catches in frost growing outward from the rims of small stones. Each stone's tiny microclimate becomes obvious in those minutes, the windward side bare first, the lee side bright with lingering ice. Along the foot of a boulder freshly rolled during the quake, a ruffle of scalloped frost marks the place where warmth from the stone's belly still feeds the air a little. Photons lift this frost grain by grain into vapour. The grains underneath settle a fraction closer together as their bridges vanish. The surface tightens like drying skin and cracks with microscopic size. Warmth finds carbon dioxide ice too, in pockets where winter's breath still hides. It does not melt. Here, it sublimates at a touch, and the gas pushes through the nearest path with a burst strong enough to lift a lid of dust and lay it down off-centre. A little fan that points back at the source the way a compass needle points at true. These are the quiet cousins of the jets that paint the polar spring, modest echoes that happen because the impact rearranged the surfaces and buried a few flakes deeper than they had planned to be. If you could take the smell of this place and hold it, it would be a scent of mineral and cold flame, though there is nothing to smell in truth. If you could listen, you would hear only a fine patter as frost changes its mind on the sunlit side of a pebble. A rustle as the skin of salt cracks and lies down. A trickle that is not water, but dust, slumping by a grain, because that is what gravity asks of it. The bigger sounds happened already and have become memory. Now the chapter is adhesion and phase change, and the brief private decisions of tiny volumes. Far from the basin, the sky wears some of this story as polar caps breathe and respond. Water vapour redistributed by the impact's warmth and dust's ride rebalances across latitudes. Instruments catch the change as a new cadence in humidity gradients, as frost lines retreating or advancing by a kilometre on a given cliff over a week. It is not dramatic, it is a reshaping of a breath. Meanwhile, high in the air, crystals grown in the first hours after the strike still tumble within thin clouds, seeding nuclei for more crystals days later. Subtle causation that strings itself out until it becomes background. A mud cone rises on the downrange plain in the days following, not high, not steep, but definite, a stacked collar of damp fines extruded from below as a pocket of pressurized brine found a soft path upward. The cone vents once, twice, then stills. Its top sags with a tiny caldera, a thumbprint pressed into clay. Around it a skirt of dark streaks dry into paler lace as salts come to the skin and declare themselves, a chemistry postcard pinned to the otherwise uniform dust. Within the central melt pond, islands form from blocks that rode the rebound and then were stranded as the molten surface congealed. They carry veneers of glass that run like frozen varnish down their sides, ending in frozen drips. In the channels between islands, bends trap floating crusts that jam and ratchet forward under the slow insistence of convection, producing pressure ridges that break and slide and then freeze where they land. On their undersides, ice grows into the melt from below, where late arriving frost wedges itself into cracks and survives long enough to cool the neighbour rock. Stalactite cousins in a world where true caves are elsewhere. When afternoon winds pick up, you can watch their lessons written in the new materials. On a fresh terrace, bright salt crusts begin to fracture into hexagons that lift at their edges and make tiny sails. Dust rushes under these sails and collects, lifting the plates higher until they topple and shatter, and are then carried as flakes into a shallow, narrow gully, where they settle and build a false strandline that says water was here in a language that is almost true. The next day the line will move up or down by a few centimetres, depending on whether the morning was kinder or the night was longer. Some fractures breathe for longer than the rest. They are connected to deeper heat reservoirs, or perhaps to layers where ice was thick at the start. They exhale water vapour at dusk and just after dawn, when the temperature gradient is steepest, and stand quiet at noon. Around them you can trace halos that change with the light. Hoarfrost at dawn, darkened soil by mid-morning, a pale bloom of salts by late afternoon. If you plotted these halos on a map and traced them over days, they would look like flowers opening and closing, adjusting to an invisible sun below, as much as to the obvious one above. All of it is temporary, which is not to say it is insignificant. The planet will keep some of these changes for years, some for months, some for sunsets only. The warmth will ebb and hand the ground back to the long cold. But until then, the old ice will keep answering the last of the fire with breaths of steam and films of liquid. Clays will keep rewriting themselves. Salts will bloom and fade. Brief fogs will kneel in low places and then rise. And down in the dark, where the shock pounded hardest, certain crystals will keep growing in the lingering heat, measuring hours in their facets, while above them a thin rind of new frost settles each night along the rim of a rock that did not exist until the day 3I Atlas pressed its memory into Martian stone. Phobos turns like a small, thoughtful stone cupped in Mars's light, always showing the same face to the big red world below. Stickney yawns across one hemisphere like an old scar, its rim softened by a blanket of powder that slides in slow motion whenever the moon shivers. On the day the bright visitor carved a flare through the Martian sky, Phobos saw the line as if it were drawn just for it. A slanted filament, bright as a welding arc, and then a blossom on the ground that swelled into a column. There is no sound here, only the soft pull of Mars filling half the sky, and the thin, steady sunlight that makes shadows as black as thoughts. The column rose, paled, spread. From up here, the new dust looked like a veil being shaken out over an enormous bed, edges feathering as winds at different heights took what they wanted. The surface of Phobos is a place where dust remembers every footstep no one has ever taken. Grains are talc fine and cling to one another by whispers of static and the faintest touch of frost each night. When the first high flyers from the plume arrived, particles too small to be stones and too large to be light, they did not strike like bullets. They tapped. A tick here, a tick there, and each tick set off a miniature celebration of motion, a puff of regolith beads lifting and settling again, avalanches the width of a pencil stream, sliding down into the grooves that stitched this little moon like the grain of wood. Some grains were new, glassy, cooling still. Some were ancient pieces of the visitor, now adopted by a moon that never asked for children and never says no. Deimos watched from farther out, slower, less sure of its place in the story, but with a wider theatre to see. Mars did not fill its sky. It hovered like a patient disk, banded now with a smudge that grew and thinned with each orbit. Deimos is rounder, less carved. Its slopes gentler, its regolith deep and forgiving. The dust that reached it arrived fewer and farther between, a more delicate rain. It left a faint brightening on certain slopes that faced the direction of motion, a subtle frosting that the next week's light will turn the colour of the rest of the ground. Where a larger fleck struck, it kicked a plume you could overstep with a single stride if strides were possible here, and the plume fell back completely. Escape is a decision for faster things. Phobos circles quickly, sunrise chasing sunset every few hours, so it saw the same newborn cloud over Mars many times, while the ground below was still hot to the touch. Each pass, the column had changed. It leaned more in the direction the high winds preferred. It unstitched itself into ribbons. It sprawled into the thin heights and forgot it had been born in one place. Looking down, Phobos watched the limb of Mars grow a delicate edge, a pale ring that brightened where dust was thickest and dimmed where the sky still remembered how to be clear. Lights from orbiters winked in and out as they slid through the glow, letters in a word you read only because you know the alphabet. On Phobos' surface, electrical charge gathers in the long shadow of the Terminator. Sunlight makes one face breathe electrons. Night gathers them back. At the boundary, grains hover and hop as if unsure which way home is. The new dust, fine and oddly shaped from its fast birth, was quick to answer these tiny fields. It stirred at dawn, lifted a hair's breadth, walked a little toward low places, and settled again. Over days, it found the floors of grooves and the inside curves of Stickney's terraces, smoothing ridges already smooth, filling corners already filled. The grooves, some as straight as a ruler and some wavering like handwriting, became darker on their floors and lighter on their lips, a detail only a patient camera would love. Every so often, a faster fragment met Phobos with enough conviction to break the quiet. There is no room here for craters with proud rims. Gravity is so polite that ejected grains do not go far. Impacts make shallow bowls that fade at the edges and a halo of sprayed powder that looks like a sigh. Some bowls lined up in chains pointing back toward the new scar on Mars, a dotted underline to the sentence written below. The largest of these bowls was still small enough to fit on a table, yet in its centre lay a bead of glass, a perfect round, black as a pupil, spun and cooled in the space of a heartbeat when 3-eye atlases met open sky. Phobos kept the bead the way it keeps everything by not letting it go. Deimos' changes were softer still. Its gentle hills wore the dust like breath on a window, here and then not, depending on the angle of light. Near its terminators, little fountains of grains woke at each orbit where static lifting beats the will of weight. They rose, drifted, and fell into the same hollows they had always preferred, now mixed with the newcomer's ash. This is how a moon that never sees weather still knows seasons, by the slow sorting of grains, by the way dawn and dusk tug on particles, until small landscapes migrate a centimetre in a year and a metre in a lifetime. Both moons are tidally locked. One face of Phobos forever contemplates Mars. Deimos does the same in a slower, more detached way. Because of this, the fresh fall painted one hemisphere more than the other, a bias the moons added to their collection of asymmetries. On Phobos' sub-Mars side, the rain was slightly thicker. Down the line from Stickney toward that fixed point, a faint albedo leash appeared. Brighter dust caught where slopes lounged toward Mars's glow, as if the big planet were a low sun that never moves. On the anti-Mars sides, the old dust remained truer to its previous shade, interrupted by only the smallest kisses from passing grains. As Mars's upper air learned to carry the new load, it shaped a faint torus of dust along the planet's equatorial corridors. Phobos's fast path cut that torus at a shallow angle, like a bee skimming a pond. Each cut lifted a little, collected a little, and left a little, until an almost ring of particles stretched along Phobos's orbit, too spare to be called a ring with a straight face, too present to deny. In sunlight, this strand was invisible. In forward scattered light at certain angles, it turned the space ahead of Phobos into a very faint glow, a breath that moved with the moon and then dispersed as sunlight and Mars's pull persuaded the finest grains to spiral elsewhere. Small gravity pulls on small things. The path of each grain was a story in miniature. A first loft from the basin, a high loop, a meeting with Phobos at a speed that would not quite let go, a bounce that wrote a new groove inside an old one, a final settling in a hollow no larger than a hand. Wherever grains landed on slopes close to the angle of repose, they triggered thin slides that travelled farther than they had any right to, because here, a nudge is a shout. The slides wrote fans at the base of every little scarp, luminous for a few days if the grains were glassy, then quietly darkened as they baked under the sun and learned the same colour vocabulary as everything else. Mars itself became a lamp. The planet's dayside stretched across the sky of Phobos and Deimos like a red lantern, and the new dust in its air made the limb glow with a rim of pearl. City light illusions came and went at the edge, changes in brightness where high veils thickened and thinned as pressure tides walked through the atmosphere twice each day. From Deimos, these changes were gentler, but the geometry was clean. A halo that swelled at one longitude and shrank at another, an orbit later appearing a few degrees along, the slow wheel of a planet breathing under a blanket it had just woven for itself. The moons felt tugs they always feel, but which mean a little more when you think of time. Phobos settles toward Mars in invisible steps, downward bound by tides that knead it as it races around the planet. Deimos drifts outward, patient as a leaf riding an air that is almost not there. The new dust did not change these journeys, but it gave them texture for a while. More grains to lift at dawn on Phobos's inward face, a slightly thicker skin to glow when the sun slid toward the horizon on Deimos's outward one. If you could lay your ear against the regolith and listen past your own blood, you might hear nothing but the steady trickle of grains testing their neighbours and deciding to stay or move a hair's breadth toward lower ground. Orbiters used the moons as backdrops. When Phobos crossed Mars, it passed in front of the bright parts of the veil, and then the darker, and instruments read the difference in a line scanner's hum, optical depth in the shape of a tiny silhouette. When Deimos eclipsed a star just as it moved through a higher dusty layer, the star was muffled for a beat longer than geometry allowed, and from that extra beat the size of grains could be guessed. These are slow sciences made from fast events, and the moons serve willingly by doing what they always do, being there, being quiet, being simple enough that every change around them shows. Night on Phobos is short, but long enough for frost to think about forming. On certain rims that face away from Mars, where the red planet's shine is a little less, a film of ice stitched itself across dust grains as the regolith radiated heat into space. The new glass beads and splinters from 3i Atlas made small islands in this film, surfaces that cooled at different rates, objects that collected slightly different layers of the night's breath. At dawn, these films broke and lifted invisibly, and the grains underneath lost the bridges that were holding them, and so a little more motion happened because a little less glue remained. This is how landscapes move when almost nothing asks them to. Sometimes when Phobos slipped across the line where Mars's shadow reaches into space, the temperature fell by a notch, so quick that regolith cracked with tiny clicks, thermal fatigue in a world where a change of tens of degrees means enough. The new dust made this drama sharper for a week or two by giving the surface a coat that radiated heat differently. The cracks were short, shallow, and countless. Each one freed a pinch of powder. Each pinch drifted downhill the next time a shaking passed or a charged dawn lifted anything willing. Over hundreds of orbits, the coat thinned, mixed, became indistinguishable from what came before. Down on Mars, the dust raised by the strike painted shadows and sunsets, and both moons watched the palette shift toward a milky gold that lingered after the sun went down. The blue band at the horizon that Mars sometimes wears at dusk grew richer, a thread of cool colour beneath the warm one, and Phobos, racing, saw it 6 times in the space of a Martian day, each time from a different angle, each time with a slightly different geometry of light passing through grains that had been lifted from the very ground the moon's own dust would someday return to by other means. Deimos saw it slower and for longer stretches, as if it had more time to read. The grooves on Phobos, some carved by stresses, some perhaps by long ago ejector sliding under low gravity, caught tiny drifts of the visitor's ash. Where grooves crossed, the drifts made corners that grew sharper. Where grooves ran parallel, the drifts smoothed the space between into runnels. A camera passing low could see shadows inside these grooves soften over a week, then regain their bite as the uppermost grain settled and darkened. Because Phobos moves so fast, sunlight samples every angle here. The map of these changes is written in minutes and fractions of degrees. The moons know nothing, but they keep everything. 1,000 small pits record 1,000 small strikes. 1,000,000 gentle slides count time the way beads count prayers. For a while, the story of 3i Atlas rode the orbits of Phobos and Deimos as dust, as glass, as stains that will be indistinguishable from native crust in a season. It rode in brightness near the limb of Mars, and in the softening of shadows on slopes that face one particular direction. It rode in the faintest possible ring that wasn't a ring, a braid of particles drawn into a path by a moon's constant hurry, and then teased away again by light. And it rode in the way a single bead, black and perfect, settled into a dimple on the floor of a shallow bowl inside Stickney, and caught the sun for a second each time. Phobos turned just so, lighting a dot on a world that otherwise never sparkles. They turn their faces upward and wait. In orbit, in the thin air and on the ground, the machines notice before we do because noticing is what they were built for. A pressure sensor blinks as the front of the blast rolls past, a brief, clean rise that doesn't belong to the usual daily tide. A sky camera sees the sun's edge soften until it looks like chalk rubbed once with a thumb. A microphone, more breath than sound in this thin world, catches a low hum as the atmosphere remembers the entry of a fast thing and the thump of a new crater. Bits accumulate. A tick, a tilt, a change in brightness, a change in temperature profile, a skew in electron density where the upper air has been brushed bright. One orbiter is already poised over the limb, its instrument slit to the side to read the atmosphere like a page. It takes a vertical slice in infrared, finds the wrinkle the shock made, and then watches that wrinkle travel, weaken and reform as it crosses waves set up by volcanoes and basins. Another points its ultraviolet eyes and sees the newborn plume as a pale torch from the night side, a stalk that glows because molecules have all been torn and are putting themselves back together in ways that spill tiny packets of light. A plasma package counts ions as they rush past. The count spikes and then relaxes. The clock on the instrument tags the exact moment a foreign breath moved through Mars's skin of air. Down on the ground, a rover's mast lifts just so. Dust climbs the sky so it switches from colour to monochrome for a while. The filters are gentler on the cameras, and the story isn't colour anyway. It's contrast. Its weather station ticks every second, temperature falling faster in the afternoon than yesterday, pressure strolling upward as the air thickens, wind shifting around obstacles it has known for years, as if it suddenly wants to try a new route. The rover listens to the air with a tiny microphone, and where there is usually a hiss and the sand's faint syllables, there is a soft, fat pulse, One, then none, then a longer, lower one. Pressure waves that rode the entry and the impact across half a world and arrived here a minute late, like a letter delivered to the wrong box and then kindly forwarded. The old cameras in the sky draw maps. Wide-angle images record a bloom that spreads from the basin, edges striated by winds at different heights, each striation a clue to a jet no human will ever feel on skin. The high-resolution eye waits for the shock to pass and then stares, rakes the surface with its narrow field until the crater is pinned, rim scalloped, floor bright where melt still holds heat. In the next pass it looks for changes, blocks that weren't there before, stripes where the surge has combed the ground. A fan that appeared at the mouth of a gully, dark now and destined to fade with salt and sun. Between passes, the orbiters whisper to Earth, thin-band radio stretched across minutes of silence, so that the lines on our screens curve into certainty and not just hope. A nuclear-powered rover never worries about dust on its back for power, but it worries about dust in the sky, because sky dust eats light and softens the world. It lowers its mast a little in gusts, turns a lens cap over a glass, nudges its laser at a rock nearer than planned, safer to measure something within arm's reach when horizons are dim. The laser flashes, the spectrometer reads the plasma it created in the rock's skin. The lines in the spectrum are the same old song, but a few have shifted because a little water visited recently and then left, changing the mineral's polish and the way it yields to light. The rover makes a note. Next hour, same spot again. The line shifts back. A solar-powered craft farther away is cautious. It peeks at its panel's current like a parent who knows the pantry is thin, and it waits in a shallow idle when the sky grows too heavy with fines. In the breaks, it wakes, nudges a wheel, takes a single panorama, tucks itself back into the low hum of maintenance power. Dust grains settled last night at a shallow angle on a frame. A twitch of thermal expansion flips them, and that is enough to lift a few more into the breeze. Tiny avalanches of particles move even on the panels. Quiet, beneficial, sometimes all that stands between sleep and waking. In the days that follow, orbiters play tag with the veil. One of them dips deeper, skimming the upper air. Drag is a whisper but measurable. The craft's path shortens a fraction of a second. The onboard accelerometer writes a little mountain where there was a hill the pass before. From these bumps, a temperature profile is teased, and from that profile, a vertical map of dust abundance. How much is where and how the where marches with the day and the layered winds. Another orbiter looks side-on again and measures how the planet's limb dims a few kilometers lower than last week. It composes the planet's new silhouette from dozens of slices, and the silhouette is thicker. Radio occultations become a favourite trick. A spacecraft comms beam edges behind the planet. A ground antenna listens to how that radio tone warbles through the air. The warble can be unfolded into density, then into pressure and temperature, and where the dust sits and how much it is, and all of that is turned into numbers that go into a model that sweeps from pole to pole and says, this is how the new sky breathes at noon, and this is how it breathes at midnight. Another antenna, somewhere on a quiet desert on Earth, turns gently and hears the same song reddened by Doppler as the orbiter rushes toward the far side, then hears nothing, then hears it again as the craft emerges from behind the curve like a fish lifting out of a wave. One lander that sleeps under a shallow blanket of its own dust rouses a single instrument because a tremor sauntered by. The tremor is not an impact itself, those sound like fists, but the after sigh of a distant slope deciding to give up another meter. Its seismometer smiles in its sleep, logs 3 neat waves in the right order, and sleeps again. Another sensor measures the opacity overhead by staring at the sun and counting how much less arrives than a clear day's promise. More opacity means longer sunsets, longer nights with that thin blue crown, lower temperatures at noon, slower chemistry on warm rocks, gentler winds in the hours around dawn, then stronger in the afternoon when slopes wake into motion. The ground changes the machines a little, too. Dust finds joints, nests in the small V's where cables enter housings, softens the relief of a logo printed for no one to read. It dulls sharp edges so the wind can keep travelling without catching. It changes thermal inertia in small patches, so a mast's shadow cools one spot more efficiently than its twin did last month. And the thermal camera notices the asymmetry and tags it as a local story. A fingertip of warmth at noon, a curling chill at night. The rover's wheels, which write sentences wherever they go, learn that in the new dust their words broaden, their letters fill in. Traction shifts, steering angles adjust by a few degrees. Some of the orbiters carry radars that can push whispers into the ground and listen for echoes. Over the new basin, the echoes are bright and confused at first. The subsurface is hot, jagged, unready to be read. Pass by pass, the echoes smooth. A flat reflector appears where melt pooled and then froze. A curtain emerges where the ejector draped down a scarp and cooled into layers. A blank patch remains where the radar does not see through the glassy lid. That, too, is information. A lake of stone that was liquid last week now presents as silence to the frequency sent downward, and silence is a kind of answer. On a ridge not far from the basin, a sanitizer's brush, what engineers call dust removal, runs gently across calibration targets. It clears a square and measures the light that bounces back. Dust lands again within hours, the square dims, the cycle repeats, and from the rate of dimming, the team infers how quickly this particular slope is painted by the veil. Compare it to the same square from last season, and the difference whispers how much of this dust is new, and how much is the planet rearranging its old wardrobe. A tiny scoop lifts a teaspoon of soil from behind a rock. It never reaches an oven. The energy budget now favours listening over baking. But even the lift is data, the texture, the way grains fall, the faint clumping where humidity nested overnight among salts. A small helicopter is gone now, remembered by its shadow chases, but its legacy remains in software the rover uses to read patterns in the sand. The rover trusts this code to tell dunes from traps, ripples from walls of collapse. In the new light, the code learns new thresholds. What was mid-tone yesterday is bright today, because dust sits here like frost and there like shadow. The rover advances along a safer path, then pauses to let wind draw lines on the ground. It records those lines as time-lapse, frames a minute apart, then 10 minutes, then an hour, till they make a film of ripples marching downwind, like a chorus line practicing slowly. High above, a communications orbiter becomes a post office with perfect timing. The atmosphere is thicker. Links are not bothered by dust grains, but geometry is more fickle when the sky is bright and the horizon late, so it lingers a little longer along its relay arc to catch a rover's burst. Packets leave the rover as a tight beam. The orbiter listens through the planet's own radio noise and the hiss of the upper air as it glows with fresh electrons. The burst ends. The orbiter turns. Another burst arrives from another hemisphere. Just weather there, just the day's accents. And onward the words go, through long antennas on Earth that harvest murmurs from space and turn them back into numbers, then lines, then images that look like tan and black, then maps that look like answers. In the weeks after the strike, the pace changes, then changes again. The dust thickens and instruments adapt. Temperature sensors take readings more often at dawn and dusk because the gradients there are now where the stories live. Planners delay long drills because coughing dust into a corer's throat is wasteful. Instead, they favour abrasion and sniffing with lasers and spectrometers that stand off a few centimetres and don't mind a breeze. A rover's arm pauses halfway because a whisper from the weather station says a gust is coming. It holds, waits, resumes when the gust passes. Less dust in the joints than there might have been. Orbiters with spectrometers see chemistry slide. In the infrared, emissivity curves tilt a little where fresh glass cooled into a skin, where clay sampled a brief film of water and became a touch more hydrated, where salts went from invisible to polite and back again as frost tried them on at night. In the ultraviolet, the edge of the planet now has a different colour ratio at twilight. That ratio is a species, a signature of particles of a certain size and shape. Over days, the signature fattens, thins, migrates. Data sets thicken on servers. Modelers pour them through codes that juggle radiation and fluid flow and sand grains and maps of slopes and turn out forecasts for tomorrow's opacity at noon over the crater, over the ridge, over the rover's exact parking place. The robots are careful librarians. They tuck away before-night images of the same rock face every day, then morning-after images with the same framing. In the pairs, fine frost signatures become obvious. Dark, turning bright, turning dark again. A rim that's travelled upward 5 centimetres overnight. A tiny new vein along a crack that was dry 2 days ago. They stack the pairs into weeks and into months until what looked like noise is revealed to be a rhythm. The rock sweats on the schedule. Instruments that sniff gases close to the ground find a heartbeat there too. More water vapour at dawn, less at noon. An afternoon hiccup when the day breeze runs down a slope from the basin and crosses the sensor like a faint perfume that cannot be named because names are for human noses. The machines remember people even while they work alone. A calibration plaque bears the outline of a coin and a laser-zapped stripe that teams back on Earth once watched with the coffee at 3 in the morning. That plaque turns tawny, is brushed, turns tawny again. A wheel bears scars from an old crossing and now gains a new sheen as dust polishes it without malice. A mast camera's baffle, once matte, glints for a minute in the low sun because the fresh veil scatters light into angles it rarely visits. The glint tickles the camera's sensor, and someone later will see a spike in the telemetry and smile, because a spike like that means the sky wore a thin dress instead of a thick one that day. Some changes are too soft to chase with pictures. They arrive as timing. A relay pass that used to be fat with margin becomes tight because the orbiter is skating through a track of air a hair denser and is arriving half a minute late at the phone booth point. Teams nudge the pass by a handful of orbits, rethread the schedule, and the tightness disappears for a week, then returns because the dust layer moved. The tug of war is gentle and endless. Mission plans are a music sheet and the sky is improvisation. The robots play with both ears open. Now and then, a fresh scar appears downrange. One of the late arriving fragments of 3I Atlas met a hillside with enough speed to do more than scuff it. The high eye catches it, a punctuation mark new since last pass. The low camera confirms it later when dust lifts and the horizon sharpens. If a rover is close enough, it sneaks a look. The rim is sharp as a cut fingernail. The floor is dark, still warm by day and slow to frost by night. A scatter of beads lies like seeds tossed from a handful, tiny globes of glass, stretched almonds of melt. Each one a record of a microsecond of heat. The rover nudges its laser to one bead and reads it. The lines in the glow say basalt plus a whisper of a traveller's carbon-rich dust, now part of it forever. It nudges the laser to the ground beside the bead and reads that too. The two signatures sit side by side on the plot like neighbours who just met and already share a story. At the edges of everything, the machines keep doing small, patient jobs. A radiation detector logs the way dust softens the sun, shaving a little from the daily tally. A magnet on a deck collects grains until it is speckled, then is imaged, then is cleaned by a gust, then collects again. A tiny wind sensor breaks a thin filament of dust and recovers, then records the blip in its own recovery time as data. A thermal inertia map grows denser by the week as the orbiter that makes it layers, pass upon pass until the resolution sharpens from tens of kilometres to single ones. And in that sharpening, someone sees a lobe of ejector that acts like it is thicker than its neighbours, and the next path for the rover on the ground is drawn a little closer to that lobe for a closer look in a month. Nothing is wasted. Even the absences matter. A planned observation misses because the dust grew thicker, faster than the model guessed. The miss is logged, the model learns. The next try goes earlier and lower, collecting a slice closer to the limb where the gradient is steeper and the information richer. A camera saturates when the plume was brighter than expected. The saturation is not a loss. It is a top of scale that tells how bright the core must have been, and from that, how hot, and from that, how much material reached what altitude in that minute. A rover's wheel slips 3% more than yesterday. The 3% becomes a map of traction, and that map becomes a safety margin for the next traverse, when the veil lifts a little and the team wants to use the extra sunlight for a longer drive. In the calm between gusts, a mast points at the sky and watches a star. The star twinkles, not with Earth's wet air mischief, but with the slow shimmer of dust's patient dance. The instrument counts the small shifts and builds a profile of turbulence, where in the thin stack of air the mixing is loud and where it is sleep. That profile layers with others, of temperature, of pressure, of dust opacity. Together they say when fog might form at dawn in a certain notch, when a frost will last past noon under a certain boulder, when a dust devil will be borne out on the flat and march toward the rover in an hour with a slender spine and a skirt of grit. The rover waits with a camera ready, not because it needs the picture, but because the picture makes the numbers human in a way that will help the next planner decide to nudge a wheel here, not there. And over all of it, the slow data continue. Orbit tracks that precess, daylight that lengthens and then lessens with the season, daily wind roses that draw themselves in tidy petals on a console in a room far away. The robots are not excited, they are exact. The sky is not surprised, it is responsive. The ground is busy, then cooling. The crater is new, then older by an hour, then older by a day, then a fixture on maps that future wheels will pass and nod to as they go looking for other stories, leaving their straight, careful lines across the dust that has learned to fall differently since the day 3i Atlas wrote its bright sentence, and the machines lifted their heads and wrote their replies in numbers. In the weeks after the light has thinned and the shock has wandered the long roads of the crust, the new basin stops being an emergency and becomes a place. It receives a name because maps need labels, and it has 1,000 measurements because questions adore coordinates. The wide-angle views harden into atlases. The terraces are counted, their heights written down. The central uplift is traced, each fracture walked by a cursor that drags out profiles and angles and small arguments about whether this ledge failed in 1 step or 3. Melt. Planes that were once white on thermal screens now glow only a little after sunset, pooling their leftover warmth like embers that know how to wait. Dust opacity curves arc and relax, then arc again on a schedule that was shy before and now is bolder. Models learn the new rhythm, then are humbled by a late afternoon surge that pushes the blue ribbon at dusk into a deeper, stranger shade. Weather remembers, climate takes notes. Somewhere in the overlap, a graduate student writes code that lets the forward scatter of sunlight off the finest grains predict how long a rover 200 kilometers away will spend asleep tomorrow, and the code works well enough that it is adopted into a mission planner's quiet rituals, a small spell repeated each morning at a desk where the coffee is always lukewarm. The seismograms from the first hours become tomograms in the months after, waves that bent through warmer zones and bounced from interfaces down in the quiet deeper, inverted into maps of the crust that look like organs lit from within. A layer that was argued about for a decade hardens into fact because the path of one arriving phase lagged by just enough, and the crater's own hammer blow served as the calibration strike no engineer could have placed by hand. Between the basin and its antipode, the ground is rearranged a little. Talus moved in gullies that never meet the sun, and those slides, added to the early wave arrivals, give the thickness of something that used to be an estimate and is now a number that changes textbooks by half a page. Rims and aprons acquire texture as the planet resumes its patient sculpting. Dark streaks born in the first day's warmth fade under salt and light until you need to squint to see them. New streaks appear where a vent breathes on schedule at dawn and dusk and writes halos that expand and contract like lungs. The downrange blanket sorts itself. Glassy pearls gather in shallow furrows. It's become beads strung by slope. Angular clasts sit where they fell until a dust devil lifts them and sets them down a metre away, then another metre, then never again. The base of a terrace sprouts a fan that grows millimetre by millimetre. With each frost that condenses, and each noon that dries, grains glue and unglue and take a step down slope so small that it makes geologists happy when the ruler proves it happened at all. Orbiters turn the basin into a calibration field. Albedo changes are tied to dust particle size distributions, emissivity to glass content, radar echo strength to the depth of the melt lid and the porosity of rubble underneath. A slit spectrometer skims across in 100 skinny lines and finds minerals that prefer the company of water gathered into stripes where brief films ran, and X-ray diffractograms from rovers that stopped along the low apron settle arguments about clays, smectite here, jarosite there, a vein of silica that surely should not be so bright unless the heat lingered in one corner longer than the thermal models allow. The models are adjusted, a footnote becomes a paragraph. In a lab on Earth, a vial of dust teased from a magnet on a rover's deck holds a story with 3 alphabets. One alphabet is the planets, iron oxides, basaltic shards, salts that have learned to bloom and shrivel with the day. Another is the shocks, glass splinters with stretched vesicles, quenched compositions that refuse to be tidy. The third is older and more private, interstellar grains bound into the body of 3I Atlas, now rubbed into a smear across the magnet's dark face, carrying isotopic oddities that are less signature than accent. Mass spectrometers wake, calibrate, purr. A peak sits a little left of where it should, if all carbon were born in the same place. A ratio hints that some of this powder kept its own clock in a different cloud before being baked into a traveller that now has a little Martian dust under its nails. Papers begin as polite drafts and then grow teeth and charts and caveats. Names accrue beyond the official one: the glass yard where spherals are thick, the ladder, where terraces stack at even intervals and glint with frost before dawn, the whisper, a notch where temperature sensors tickle and waggle when slope winds pass and a fog collects without ever committing to the word cloud. Rovers know these names because people do, and people tuck them into command notes when the day's traverse skirts a slope whose fine grains would prefer to slide under wheels if given the hint. A wheel track from the first week is part filled now. A camera looks back and records the way the groove softened, the letters of the tread rounding like handwriting in rain. Wheel slip is measured as a percentage and becomes a map of traction. Traction becomes a decision about whether to accept the long path along the rim or the short path across the apron next Tuesday. Catalogues change. The crater count chronology used to hang on a handful of dated events. Now it is revised by a strike whose age is not in doubt. Secondary fields downstream provide a new calibration for what a certain size impact sprays how far in a given atmosphere. Old debates about whether a string of small bowls is a secondary chain or a volcano's cough are resolved in favour of the chain more often, because the geometry here is so clear. An elegant curve fit to distal ray lengths and fragment sizes trickles outward into other maps, and the ages of units not touched by the event slide by thousands of years that are culturally nothing and scientifically plenty. Someone's dissertation gets a new figure 7 and a revised conclusion. The moons keep their own tally. A speck of glass that lodged on a slope inside Stickney is tallied by a passing camera, then not seen the next pass because it rolled into deeper shade. The tally becomes a footnote on regolith mobility under low electrical fields at dawn, and that footnote becomes a line in an operations memo because the next mission wants to anchor a sensor in a groove and would prefer it not to migrate on a schedule set by the sun. Deimos's slight brightening along a track facing prograde becomes a limit on how much of the plume climbed to that height and stayed coherent. The limit checks a box in a model of dust torus lifetimes that a few years ago existed only in notebooks. Inside the basin, the melt that once pooled like mercury now wears a brittle skin of cooling fractures that have spread into polygons the size of rooms. In the centre, a crack widened until it became a trench. Its sides peeled and lay down in escalated plates. The trench exposes layers like pages, each with a different gloss depending on how quickly a particular few centimetres lost heat. At certain times of day, sunlight walks these steps and throws a comb of shadows that repeats every afternoon a little to the left, because seasons lean the light into a new angle. The comb is measured, and from the movement of shadows across known heights, the date and hour on Mars can be read without clocks. Someone builds a sundial app for a rover team that doesn't need it but enjoys knowing it exists. What was thought unimportant reveals itself because it refuses to go away. The thin brines that fed one dark streak at the base of a scarp dry and leave a pale crust, which deepens in tone over a week, which then blanches again after a frost. The colour cycle matches humidity swings measured by a sensor kilometres distant, and the pairing implies a reach of vapour transport not in the old tables. The reach is entered into a code used to predict where frost will persist under rocks large enough to shelter interest, but small enough for a robot arm to move. Coordinates result. A rover drags a boulder the size of a suitcase to the right and photographs the place where it was. A bright patch blinks and fades. A spectrum catches a bite of water before it is gone. Little wins accumulate into confidence. This event alters engineering as quietly as it alters science. Designers adjust dust tolerances on future solar arrays upward by a margin harvested from these weeks. Anti-adhesive coatings that worked in a chamber under certain humidity levels are revised because the new veil taught a trick about electrostatic clumping that didn't show on Earth. A lander's air filter design earns a thicker layer margin after charts from the plume's ionization trail suggest the upper air can carry smaller particles higher than expected for longer than expected. When the pressure tides have a certain phase relationship to the thermal tides, the graphs are dull in isolation. There are mint hardware in the aggregate. Earth sees a glimmer of the thing that happened, not the flash. That's the domain of local eyes. But the way Mars's overall colour drifts by a whisper, measured by telescopes that do not normally make news for their patience. Spectrophotometric sequences stack across nights. The limb's brightness in forward scatter grows a notch, then slides down. The notch is compared with historical storms and is less, but the slope of decay is sharper here, and that slope becomes a clue to particle-sized distributions that were models and are now almost observations. A public plot appears that shows this in a friendly way. It is retweeted once by someone who built their career on Saturn's rings, and smiles at a hint that even rocky worlds do brief ring impressions when something big exhales. There is astrobiology in the air without declarations or headlines. Not in life, but in habit. How organics behave when warmth and water are introduced in short, sharp doses. A rover points a laser into a shady crack where a thin film lasted longer 2 days in a row, and looks for aromatic signatures in the glow. Careful about controls, careful about memory. Careful because the planet is a place and not a puzzle to be finished and put away. The lines match dust familiar from space, the CHON, family, in more than one arrangement, and match faintly a contaminant measured and subtracted. What remains is a small anomaly noted, held, not rushed, employed as a flag for later revisits when energy and weather allow. Stargazers with their own plans redraw some lines. A future sample return cache that would have studiously avoided this basin in order to keep to a quiet stratigraphy now is reconsidered because 1 or 2 tubes of this glass would knit a story to be compared with glass from old impacts to anchor a chronology with fewer guesses. The cache route does not swing this far, not yet. A field team on Earth tests a mechanism that can split fragile spherules into halves while keeping their interiors pristine. The mechanism breaks the first 3 tries, the 4th holds. Someone puts a sticker with a tiny red dot on the case, not in pride but as a reminder that the world that suggested the tool is waiting. People elsewhere visit old paper. Impact scaling relations get a second reading with pink highlighter. Atmospheric energy deposition curves are walked finger by finger, and CF becomes the also as citations are added to paragraphs that will teach the next cohort why thin air is not a loophole but a parameter. A professor begins a lecture with a slide of the new basin, at different times of day, and ends with a map of thermal flux that looks like a weather report, and in between a generation receives the idea that a thing which happened once will happen again and should be thought about with more verbs than fear. A student at the back says something about regolith cohesion under low humidity that makes a row of heads tilt and then nod, perspective drifts, impacts stop being only catastrophe and re-enter the conversation as agencies. They dig, mix, heat, sort, they expose, they brille. They write rinds of glass that trap old air and delicate ionic perfumes. They throw stones into places where rovers were not going to go, and then convince everyone that perhaps a detour is justified after winter, because curves near the rim imply a cryofracture that will keep exhaling for a season longer, and who are we to ignore a season? A dust devil born on the apron heads out over the plain at midday and pulls a ribbon of bright from beneath a skin that was uniform yesterday. The ribbon is a reminder. The planet will keep editing, we should keep reading. The questions multiply and lean into specifics. How long does the melt take to become a single mechanical layer fit for a drill? Where does the last vein of brine retreat when the evening takes its heat back? And what salts does it leave on its threshold? How often will frost repeat in the shadow under a block with this exact height and thermal inertia? And when it repeats, does it carry and lay down the same micron-sized glass chips, or a selection biased by the wind field that we have only sketched? Which fractures connect to the deeper zone that the seismic inversions marked as warmer? And can a contact microphone on a rock hear their tiny sighs at dawn? If a small helicopter were still alive, would it fly differently in this new air? And would its downward gusts write legible script on the powder of the ramparts? There are proposals, a CubeSat to trail Mars at the altitude of high dust, metal jaw open like a fish, filters ready to bite particles at set angles to the sun, a low-pass radar to sound the basin every 6 months for a decade, letting the cooling curve under the lid serve as a thermometer that reaches deeper than heat probes can, a lander that drops a string of microseismometers across one terrace so that when a nightly crack workshopped by the cold runs from one end to the other, the wavefront speed reveals how the crust under this one corner differs in stiffness from the crust under the next, a weather mast to hum alongside, a scoop to test the stickiness of the same dust at different hours. The quiet accumulates new indices. The limb brightening is now a number in the daily digest sent to anyone who likes such numbers. The median frost persistence under boulders of a given diameter is a histogram that gets a new bar daily. The crater's albedo anomaly relative to its surroundings is a trend line that wandered up, then down, then up again, after a late front unpacked a pocket of fines from a notch so narrow that nobody noticed it in the first surveys. Each index is a bell that rings when it deviates from its new normal. When a bell rings, someone checks the wind and the time of day and whether Phobos is crossing the face right now and whether the radio occultation geometry is favourable, and sometimes all of those answers line up and a small orchestra of instruments plays together for 20 minutes straight. Even the metaphors get updated. Impacts have long been called punctuation marks in the planet's story. This one teaches that they also are editors who rearrange paragraphs and lay in citations from other libraries. The citation in this case is the dust of 3I Atlas. Its isotopes a shade off, its structure a touch more primitive where carbon is concerned, its inclusions not the same as the planet's. The presence of that citation in Martian glass will let a future reader pick up a single bead from the apron and say, "This one sentence was quoted," and then ask what the quotation changed in the meaning of the page it landed on, and then check the footnotes where the noble gases slept, and then turn the page because the paragraph keeps going and the editor did not write an ending.